naked strangers, boiling water, buckets of sweat, lice, and other things. You're not bathing, you're cleaning, and it's your fifth shift today. This story soaks you in the steamy nightmare of working as a medieval bath attendant, a job that combined janitorial duties, crowd control, awkward nudity, and zero respect. Public bathhouses were supposed to be relaxing. They rarely were. You had to scrub floors, empty used tubs, refill hot water by hauling it upstairs, and politely look away while very unholy things happened behind steam curtains. Black humor bubbles up through tales of barbers shaving customers mid bath, nobles ordering wine to the tub, and bathhouses doubling as brothels with plumbing. If you slipped, you broke your nose. If you didn't, someone yelled at you for using the wrong herbs. And then you still had to clean the bucket. Compared to modern spas, this was medieval customer service with extra nudity and open wounds. The pre-dawn air, sharp and unforgiving, did little to stir the city from its slumber. But within the stone bowels of the great baths, a different kind of awakening was already underway. It wasn't the gentle unfurling of consciousness, but a brutal, immediate immersion into a world where the air itself was a thick, cloying soup of yesterday's exertions. The scent was a potent, layered perfume, the acrid tang of human sweat, the ghosts of cheap industrial lye soap, the faint underlying mildew clinging to damp timbers, and, if one were particularly unlucky, the lingering aroma of something far less savory that had been carelessly disposed of in the night. This was the symphony that greeted Thomas, not with a rousing fanfare, but with a damp, heavy hand on his shoulder, yanking him from the meager warmth of his straw-filled pallet. His morning ritual was not one of invigorating ablutions, but of a grim, Sisyphean battle against the accumulated detritus of 1,000 previous lives. The great wooden tubs, behemoths carved from ancient waterlogged timber, stood like silent, accusing sentinels. Their surfaces, worn smooth by generations of shifting bodies, were slick with a film that defied simple description. It was a viscous, murky broth, a testament to the uninhibited release of the day before. For Thomas, this was his battlefield, and his weapon was a broad, scraped wooden paddle, its edge softened by years of similar, thankless work. He plunged it into the stagnant depths, the icy shock of familiar torment, to his already chapped hands. The water was once hot and inviting, was now a tepid, swirling testament to the sheer volume of humanity it had endured. He was not a purveyor of ancient Roman luxury, where marble and perfumed oils whispered of civilized indulgence. No, this was a working-class bathhouse, a necessary evil for a city that, for all its aspirations, was still a creature of mud and sweat. His task was to coax this fetid tide from its confines, to drag it, sloshing and revolting, to the nearest drain, a gaping maw in the stone floor that promised only a temporary respite before the cycle began anew. He waded into the waist-high gloom, the water clinging to his thin, damp tunic like a second skin. Each movement was a deliberate effort, a physical exertion that resonated in the very marrow of his bones. The paddle scraped against the wood, a grating sound that echoed in the cavernous space, a monotonous soundtrack to his Sisyphean task. He'd feel for the slight give of the wooden plugs, his fingers already numb and pruny, and then he'd brace himself, levering his meager strength against the ingrained resistance. The water, heavy with dissolved salts, sweat, and unidentifiable organic matter, would surge, a sluggish brown tide that threatened to engulf him. He'd paddle it towards the drains, his eyes squinting against the dim light, trying to avoid looking too closely at the floating debris, the stray hairs, the unidentifiable particles that danced in the gloom. This was the reality of his station, the lowliest rung on a ladder that seemed to stretch into an endless, foggy abyss. He scrubbed the floors next, the rough stone grating against his knees through the thin fabric of his trousers, each stroke a dull ache that promised to linger long after the morning's labor was done. It was a constant, gnawing reminder of his place in the world, a world that saw him not as a person, but as a function, a pair of hands to wrestle with the unending tide of filth. The chill of the pre-dawn was nothing compared to the pervasive dampness that seemed to permeate the very stones of the bathhouse. It was a cold that seeped into your bones, a persistent companion that never truly left, even when the fires were roaring in the furnaces. Thomas, already awake for hours, felt the familiar ache in his shoulders and the dull throb in his lower back. He was a young man, barely past his 20th year, but the relentless physicality of his work was already etching lines of premature weariness onto his face. His hands, perpetually immersed in water and harsh cleansing agents, were a roadmap of cracks and calluses, the skin raised and angry, a constant low-grade testament to the indignity of his profession. The first hint of true dawn was a subtle softening of the oppressive darkness outside, a faint gray smear against the grimy skylights that punctuated the high vaulted ceiling. It was the signal for the unwashed masses to begin their pilgrimage. Not a spiritual quest, mind you, but a desperate, primal need to shed the grime of their own meager existences, to find, if only for an hour, a brief respite from the suffocating reality of their lives. They came, a shuffling, grumbling tide, their faces etched with the same weariness that already marked Thomas's own, though their weariness stemmed from a different source, from the fields, the workshops, the cramped and stifling tenements. He watched them arrive, a motley collection of laborers, artisans, and the simply unfortunate. Their clothes, such as they were stained and worn, their boots caked with the mud of the city's unpaved streets. They were a testament to the city's relentless, unforgiving nature, a mass of humanity simply trying to survive, to find some small measure of comfort in a world that offered precious little. Thomas's role was to facilitate this brief escape, to provide the heat, the water, and the rudimentary tools of cleansing. He was the gatekeeper to a temporary sanctuary, a fragile illusion of cleanliness in a world perpetually threatened by decay. His first task, even before the majority of patrons began to trickle in, was to ensure the fires beneath the great copper boilers were sufficiently stoked. This was no gentle tending of embers. It was a wrestling match with roaring flames, a defiance of the encroaching cold that threatened to reclaim the bathhouse in its icy grip. He'd heave shovelfuls of coal into the gaping mouths of the furnaces, the heat searing his face, the acrid smoke stinging his eyes. The rhythmic clang of the shovel against metal was another sound added to the morning's chorus, a percussive beat that underscored the relentless rhythm of his labor. The water in the boilers would begin to sigh, then hiss, then rumble, a slow, agonizing transformation from frigid to scalding. It was a delicate balance, too cool, and the patrons would complain with vociferous displeasure, their wallets remaining stubbornly shut. Too hot, and the risk of scalding was ever present, a terrifying possibility that haunted every attendant. As the first waves of patrons arrived, the bathhouse transformed from a somber, echoing space into a hubbub of activity. The air grew thicker, the steam beginning to condense on the walls, dripping down in slow, greasy rivulets. The murmur of voices rose, a cacophony of greetings, complaints, and the occasional burst of raucous laughter. Thomas, his tasks momentarily shifting, would be there to greet them, his demeanor a carefully calibrated mix of deference and practiced efficiency. He'd take their meager coins, the worn copper and silver tokens of their hard earned wages, and point them towards the changing rooms, dimly lit cubbyholes where they would shed their day's burdens. He'd often catch snippets of their conversations, fragments of their lives that offered fleeting glimpses into the world beyond the bathhouse walls. Talk of bread prices, of the latest pronouncements from the city council, of minor skirmishes in the ongoing territorial disputes that plagued the outlying districts. It was a world that felt both intimately familiar and impossibly distant. Thomas, standing there in his damp, rough spun tunic, his hands raw from his morning toil, was a silent observer, a phantom in their midst, his own existence acknowledged only in the brief exchange of coin for service. The sheer volume of water that needed to be managed was staggering, not just the initial draining, but the constant replenishment, the careful monitoring of temperatures, the occasional need to top up a tub that was proving particularly popular, or more often, the frustrating task of draining one that had become too communal. There was a grim pragmatism to it all, a tacit understanding that hygiene was a secondary concern, a distant luxury compared to the immediate, visceral need for warmth and a temporary escape from the grime. He'd seen men, their bodies covered in the telltale rashes of pox or the lingering sores of hard labor, immersing themselves in the very same water that the next patron would share. It was a testament to a society that, while striving for some semblance of order, was still deeply mired in the realities of widespread poverty and rudimentary sanitation. His own hands bore the brunt of this constant immersion. The skin was never truly dry, always carrying the faint scent of the chemicals used to keep the tubs from becoming entirely a breeding ground for unseen horrors. He'd spend hours after the crowds had thinned, meticulously scrubbing the wooden planks of the bathing floor, his knees protesting with every movement, his back a tight knot of exhaustion. The lye soap, potent and effective at its job, was a brutal enemy to his skin, stripping away not just dirt, but also any semblance of natural protection. He'd sometimes catch his reflection in the rippling surface of a half-emptied tub, a gaunt young man with perpetually tired eyes, and wonder if this was it, if this was the sum total of his existence, to be forever wading through the filth of others. The contrast between his own existence and that of the patrons, particularly the wealthier ones who would arrive later in the day, was a constant, simmering resentment, a dark ember that he carefully kept banked. He was the one who toiled in the stagnant depths, the one whose knees ached from scrubbing, the one whose hands were permanently chapped and sore. They, on the other hand, were simply customers, recipients of a service their comfort and satisfaction the only measure of his own worth. And as he finished draining the last of the truly murky water, a sense of weary resignation settled over him. The city was beginning to stir in earnest, and soon the real grind would begin. A day of endless demands, of wading through not just water, but also the effluvia of human vanity, necessity, and all too often sheer unadulterated contempt. His morning ritual was complete, a grim prelude to the relentless symphony of steam and squalor that would define his day. The delicate dawn, a fragile bloom against the city's perpetual gray, did little to soften the hardened edges of the bathhouse's morning. For Thomas, the pre-dawn chill was already a distant memory, replaced by the biting heat that radiated from the furnaces he'd been feeding since the witching hour. He'd wrestled the last of the great wooden tubs into a semblance of cleanliness, his knuckles raw and bleeding from the abrasive scrub, his back a symphony of protesting aches. He was, in essence, still submerged in the filth, only now it was the lingering residue of 1,000 unwashed bodies, a spectral presence that clung to the very air he breathed. His own attire, a simple loincloth that offered scant protection against the omnipresent damp and the abrasive elements, was a badge of his station, utilitarian, grimy, and utterly devoid of pretension. Then the shift began, not a gentle transition, but a jarring discord. The murmuring tide of laborers and common folk, their faces etched with the familiar lines of daily toil, began to thin. They'd paid their few coins, found their spot in the steaming rooms, and for Thomas, their needs were a predictable, if grueling, set of tasks. But with the waxing sun came a different breed. The heavy oak doors, usually ajar to admit the early risers, were now flung open with a deliberate, arrogant flourish. The air, already thick with steam and the earthy scent of humanity, suddenly acquired a new, sharper aroma, the faint, cloying sweetness of expensive perfumes, attempting and failing to mask the underlying musk of privilege. The first to arrive was a merchant, a man whose girth seemed to have outstripped his civic responsibility, his face a florid testament to a lifetime of indulgence. He strode in, his silks rustling like dry leaves, his voice already booming, cutting through the residual hum of the working class crowd. "Attendant," he bellowed, his voice echoing off the damp stone walls. "The water. It's not right." Thomas, his hands still slick with the water he'd used to scrub down the last of the patrons, approached with a practiced, deferential nod. He'd learned early on that outright defiance was a fool's game. A passive, almost invisible obedience was the only currency that kept him from utter ruin. "My lord," he began, his voice low, trying to keep it from being swallowed by the merchant's booming pronouncements. "Is the temperature not to your liking?" The merchant snorted, a sound like a startled hog. "Not to my liking? It's tepid, boy. Tepid. I demand the soothing warmth that eases the humors, not this lukewarm bathwater fit for a peasant child." He gestured imperiously towards one of the larger, more private bathing alcoves. "Fetch me more heat, and quickly, before I decide to lodge a formal complaint with the proprietors. My constitution cannot abide such neglect." Thomas swallowed the retort that rose unbidden, a sharp observation about the irony of demanding soothing warmth after a morning spent wrestling with furnaces that threatened to melt the very lead in the pipes. Instead, he bowed again. Immediately, my lord. He turned and made his way to the boiler room, the merchant's accusatory gaze burning into his back. He carefully nudged the grate of the primary furnace, adding a few more shovelfuls of coal, the flames leaping with a hungry roar. It was a delicate balance. Too much, and the water would be scalding, a guaranteed way to incur a different kind of wrath. Too little, and the merchant's complaints would become a persistent, grinding irritation, a small torture that could unravel the rest of his day. He adjusted the flow of water into the boiler, a painstaking process of trial and error, all while the merchant's impatient grumbling filtered through the steam-filled air. As he returned, the merchant was already settled into the alcove, his ample frame submerged up to his chin. He splashed a hand, sending a wave of steaming water over the stone lip of the tub. Is that better? Thomas ventured, his voice betraying none of the weariness that was already settling into his bones. The merchant took a slow, deliberate sip from a goblet of ruby red wine that had inexplicably appeared beside his tub, another demand made without the courtesy of speaking to Thomas. It is passable, he conceded, his tone dripping with condescension, but the heat is still not quite right. A degree or two more, and perhaps a touch of lavender oil for the water. My skin requires the finest emollients, you understand. Thomas could only nod. Lavender oil. He didn't even know where to find lavender oil. He hadn't been privy to the stores beyond the rough-hewn crates of soap and the sacks of coal. He made a mental note to discreetly question the head attendant later, a man whose own indifference was a legend in its own right. The irony of it all was a bitter draught. He, Thomas, whose hands were perpetually chapped and cracked from the harsh lye soap, whose skin was perpetually damp and smelling faintly of mildew and sweat, was now being tasked with ensuring the silken comfort of a man who likely bathed in perfumed oils at home. Before he could even process the merchant's latest demand, a new arrival cut through the already charged atmosphere. This was a young knight, all gleaming mail and puffed out chest, the residual scent of horse and sweat still clinging to him despite the early hour. He'd clearly come directly from the tournament grounds, his armor, once polished to a mirror sheen, now dulled by dust and the grime of combat. He swaggered towards the bathing area, his squire trailing a respectful, if weary, distance behind him. Attendant, the knight barked, his voice still carrying the bravado of the joust. My armor needs attention. See that it's polished to a proper gleam before I emerge. And tell the kitchen I require a platter of roasted boar and a skin of the strongest ale. I've had a strenuous morning. He glanced disdainfully at Thomas's loincloth. You there, in the attire, fetch it, and do try not to drip any of your bathwater onto my silks. Thomas felt a surge of something akin to cold fury, quickly suppressed. A night. He'd spent the morning meticulously draining and scrubbing the communal baths, wrestling with furnaces, and now he was expected to polish armor while clad in almost nothing. The absurdity of it was almost suffocating. He was no squire, no servant privy to the inner workings of these men's lives. He was a bathhouse attendant, tasked with the most menial of duties. Yet, here he was, being ordered to perform tasks far beyond his purview, all while being treated as if his very existence was an insult. He caught the eye of the squire, a boy not much older than himself, burdened by the weight of his master's accoutrements and his master's arrogance. The squire offered a flicker of commiseration, a shared glance of understanding, in the face of such a overweening entitlement. It was a small, almost imperceptible connection, but it was enough to keep Thomas from cracking. "My lord," Thomas began, his voice carefully neutral, "the armor polishing is not typically within my duties. Perhaps your squire." The knight's already florid face deepened in color. "Insolence!" he roared, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of his sword. "Do you know who I am? I am Sir Calin, and I demand satisfaction." Thomas flinched, not from fear of the sword, but from the sheer, unadulterated contempt in the knight's voice. He was less than a man in the knight's eyes, less than a servant. He was an object, an inconvenience to be barked at and ordered about. He quickly interjected, "My apologies, Sir Calin. I misspoke. It is just that my duties are extensive, and I must ensure the baths themselves are properly maintained. The proprietors are most particular about the water temperature, you see." He gestured subtly towards the merchant's alcove, implying that his time was already being consumed by such critical matters. Sir Calin scoffed, but the implied threat of a ruined bath seemed to hold more sway than any appeal to his sense of order. "See that you attend to it after you have ensured my comfort," he conceded with a dismissive wave of his hand. "And don't dawdle. The steam is already dissipating." He then proceeded to gesture for his squire to begin the arduous task of removing the armor, a painstaking process that involved unlatching buckles and carefully peeling away the metal plates. Thomas watched, a knot of resentment tightening in his stomach, as the squire began the buffing, his own hands already blistered from the earlier work. The day continued in this vein, a relentless assault of demands and condescension. A noblewoman, veiled and perfumed, arrived with a retinue of servants, but still found it necessary to summon Thomas to adjust the steam flow in her private bathing chamber. She spoke to him, not directly, but through one of her maids, as if the very act of addressing him directly would somehow contaminate her. "Tell him," she'd instructed the maid, her voice a silken whip, "that the mist is not thick enough. It is barely enough to shroud one's contemplation. He will add more steam and see that it is scented with rose petals, and ensure he does not loiter." Thomas, already damp from tending to a particularly boisterous group of traders who insisted on singing bawdy sea shanties while they bathed, felt his patience fraying at the edges. Rose petals. He wouldn't know a rose petal if it landed on his bare chest. He was a creature of soap and steam and scrubbing brushes, not of delicate floral essences. He dutifully adjusted the steam valves, imagining for a fleeting moment that he could infuse the vapor with the scent of his own simmering indignation. The more affluent patrons seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to find fault with everything. A portly barrister, his face a mask of perpetual displeasure, complained that the water, which Thomas had meticulously adjusted to a perfect toasty warmth, was far too cool. "This is unacceptable," he boomed, his voice carrying the authority of the courtroom. "I have clients waiting, and I cannot attend to them looking like a boiled lobster." Reduce the heat, boy. Reduce it immediately. Thomas, who had just received a stern lecture from his supervisor for allowing the temperature to dip too low for a previous patron, felt a phantom lashing across his back. A carelessly flung sponge, saturated with the communal bathwater, sailed through the air, narrowly missing his head and splattering against the stone wall. The culprit, a burly, red faced man who had been laughing heartily moments before, offered a sheepish but ultimately unrepentant grin. It was a constant dance, a precarious balancing act between appeasing these demanding individuals and simply surviving the physical and emotional toll of their whims. The indignity was a constant gnawing companion. He would stand, barely clothed, enduring their disdainful glances, their curt commands, their casual disregard for his person. He was the silent engine of their comfort, the invisible hand that ensured their fleeting moments of cleanliness and relaxation. He fetched wine, he adjusted steam, he scrubbed floors, he drained tubs, all while being treated as less than human, a mere functional cog in their elaborate machinery of leisure. The irony was a bitter, persistent taste in his mouth. He who toiled in the very essence of their impurities was expected to remain untainted, subservient, and utterly invisible. He was a necessary evil, a creature of the steam and squalor, forever bound to serve those who saw him as nothing more than a shadow on the wall. And as the day wore on, and the calls for more wine, for hotter water, for cleaner towels continued to rain down upon him, Thomas found himself wondering if the steam itself was starting to seep into his very soul, clouding his judgment and making him forget, just for a moment, the simmering resentment that kept him, against all odds, from breaking entirely. The cacophony of the bathhouse, usually a symphony of splashing water and gruff laughter, was soon to be punctuated by a new, sharper sound, the rasp of a whetstone against steel. A stout, balding man, his apron stained with a rainbow of bodily fluids and what Thomas suspected were less natural substances, had set up a makeshift barber's station near the entrance of the main bathing hall. His stool, a rickety affair of splintered wood, was positioned precariously close to a drain that constantly gurgled with lukewarm, soapy water. The barber, a man who introduced himself with a hearty slap on Thomas's shoulder that nearly sent him sprawling, as Silas the shearer, had apparently found a niche market amongst the bathhouse patrons who wished to combine their ablutions with a bit of facial grooming. Thomas watched with a mixture of morbid fascination and sheer terror as Silas began his ministrations. The barber's razor, a formidable piece of curved steel, glinted menacingly in the dim, steamy light. Silas, with a flourish that suggested a profound lack of regard for the safety of anyone within a 10-foot radius, would beckon his clients, usually men still damp and fragrant with soap, to sit. The air, already thick with the cloying scent of human sweat and the less pleasant odor of stagnant water, now carried the sharp, metallic tang of the barber's strop. It was a dangerous ballet. A sudden stumble, a misjudged movement, a drunken lurch. Any of these could turn a simple shave into a gruesome spectacle. Thomas found himself instinctively flinching every time Silas drew the razor across a patron's stubble, half expecting to hear a choked cry, a splash, and then the grim accounting of severed arteries. One particular patron, A portly man with a beard that rivaled the density of a badger's pelt had chosen to have his entire beard shaved off, a drastic transformation that seemed to require the focused attention of Silas for a good 15 minutes. As Silas meticulously worked, his brow furrowed in concentration, the patron, emboldened by a flask of cheap wine he'd managed to sneak in, began to regale Silas with a particularly salacious story. The barber, his attention clearly divided between the tale and the precarious removal of whiskers, nodded vigorously, his hand moving with a speed that Thomas found utterly unnerving. A bead of sweat, glistening on the patron's temple, dripped precariously close to the razor's edge. Thomas held his breath, his gaze fixed on the scene, his knuckles white as he gripped a damp rag. It was a testament to the sheer desperation for even the slightest semblance of personal care that men would subject themselves to such an obvious risk. Silas, it seemed, was more than just a barber. As the day wore on, and the ebb and flow of bathhouse clientele shifted, Thomas began to notice a subtler, more clandestine trade commencing in the shadows of the bathing rooms. The alcoves, designed for a modicum of privacy, began to serve a different purpose. Hushed conversations, punctuated by the clinking of coins and the exchange of furtive glances, became a common occurrence. It was in these dimly lit corners, shrouded by the omnipresent steam, that the bathhouse shed its utilitarian skin and revealed a more illicit, perhaps even more vital, underbelly. He saw men, their faces flushed with a mixture of exertion and desire, slipping away from the communal pools into the more secluded chambers. Sometimes it was a quick, furtive embrace, a whisper shared against the damp stone. Other times, it was a more prolonged, deliberate negotiation, the exchange of coins for services rendered that had nothing to do with cleanliness. The air in these alcoves thickened not just with steam, but with unspoken promises and the scent of desperation. Thomas, tasked with polishing the brass fixtures, a futile effort, as they were perpetually tarnished by the acidic moisture, found himself a reluctant witness to these furtive transactions. He'd be bent over a particularly stubborn patch of grime on a wash basin, his ears tuned to the sounds around him, and catch snippets of conversation that sent a cold dread through him. He saw a burly dock worker, his massive frame still slick with sweat from his labors, emerge from an alcove with a sly grin, pressing a few coins into the palm of a young man who quickly scurried away, his cheeks flushed a deep crimson. Thomas, in his efforts to appear invisible, to simply be another fixture of the steamy environment, found his eyes drawn to these interactions. He'd see women, their faces shadowed by their veils, engaging in hushed, urgent conversations with men who were clearly not their husbands. The steam, which was meant to cleanse, seemed to act as a veil for a different kind of impurity, a silent lubricant for the city's unacknowledged desires. There was a particular alcove, a corner alcove at the far end of the hall, that seemed to be the epicenter of this hidden commerce. Thomas would often find himself polishing the brass railing that led to it, his movements deliberate and slow, his ears straining to catch the hushed negotiations. He once saw a finely dressed gentleman, his silks rustling even in the damp air, emerge from this alcove with a satisfied smirk, tossing a coin to a cloaked figure who melted back into the shadows. The gentleman then proceeded to the main bathing area, splashing his face with water as if to wash away any residual contact. Yet the smugness on his face spoke volumes. The whispers, however, were the most insidious. They slithered through the steam, carried on the humid air, hinting at secrets and indiscretions. Thomas heard fragments of conversations that spoke of borrowed money, of favors owed, of promises made and broken. He heard the hurried rustle of fabric, the muffled thud of a body against stone, the soft sighs that were quickly swallowed by the pervasive damp. It was a constant, low hum of activity beneath the surface of the mundane business of bathing. He remembered one afternoon, while meticulously scrubbing down the wooden benches, he overheard a conversation between two patrons who had clearly imbibed more than their share of ale. They were leaning against the wall, their voices slurred but their intent chillingly clear. It said she'd do it for 10 coppers. One slurred, nudging his companion. 10 for that little slip of a thing? She's getting greedy. The other chuckled a guttural sound. Greedy? Or just smart? These rich fools will pay anything for a bit of excitement, won't they? Especially when the wives are away. Thomas recoiled, not from the words themselves, but from the utter casualness with which they discussed the commodification of human intimacy. Silas the shearer, ever the opportunist, seemed to have carved out his own small empire within this clandestine world. Thomas observed him, time and again, leaning in to whisper something into a patron's ear after a particularly close shave. Sometimes the patron would nod, a knowing smirk playing on his lips, and then discreetly slip Silas a coin that was clearly more than the price of a haircut. Silas would then, with a wink and a nod, gesture towards one of the more secluded alcoves. It was a symbiotic relationship, a testament to the bathhouse's ability to cater to every conceivable need, from the practical to the profoundly depraved. Thomas, caught in the middle of it all, felt a growing sense of unease. He was meant to be an attendant, a cleaner, a man who ensured the smooth operation of the baths. Yet, his duties seemed to expand and contract with the whims of the patrons, pulling him into the orbit of their desires and their transactions. He was meant to be invisible, but his polishing of the brass fixtures, his careful attention to the steam valves, his mere presence, made him a silent observer, a witness to the city's hidden vices. The smell of mildew, a constant companion in the damp, cavernous space, seemed to deepen, to take on a new, more insidious aroma. It mingled with the sweat, the cheap perfume, the metallic tang of Silas's razor, and the faint, unsettling scent of clandestine encounters. Thomas found himself increasingly dissociating from his surroundings, his mind retreating to a place where the demands of the patrons, the whispers in the alcoves, and the potential for a razor's accidental slip ceased to exist. He would focus on the intricate patterns of condensation on the tiled walls, on the rhythmic drip of water from a leaky pipe, anything to anchor himself in a reality that didn't involve the unsettling commerce unfolding around him. He was policed by the steam, his world a perpetual twilight of diffused light and swirling vapor, making it impossible to truly see, yet close enough to hear the secrets that the city dared not speak in the open. The bathhouse, it seemed, was not merely a place for physical cleansing. It was a crucible for the city's hidden appetites, a stage where the mundane and the illicit danced a perpetual, steamy waltz. And Thomas, the bathhouse attendant, was merely a silent, perpetually damp spectator, polishing the brass, forever caught in the cross currents of steam and squalor, of shaves and whispered assignations, a shadow in the perpetual twilight of other men's pleasures and transgressions. He often wondered if the persistent dampness that clung to his skin was merely the bathhouse's moisture, or if it was the condensation of all the unshed tears, the unspoken fears, and the furtive desires that permeated the very air he breathed. The barber's blade was sharp, but the whispers of the brothel that bloomed in the alcoves were far more cutting. The notion of cleanliness, as Thomas understood it, was a fragile, almost laughable concept within the cavernous, steamy embrace of the bathhouse. It was a place where the very air seemed to conspire against such delicate notions, where the constant swirl of vapor obscured reality with a comforting, yet ultimately deceitful, haze. Here, hygiene was not a practice, but a fleeting aspiration, a whispered hope that rarely, if ever, materialized. The communal pools, vast and perpetually steaming, were treated less like vessels for cleansing and more like shared lukewarm baths for the entire city. The water, drawn from its subterranean source with a vigor that hinted at lifeblood, was subjected to a relentless cycle of use, reuse, and abuse. Once the fires beneath the great cauldrons were stoked, the water was heated, yes, but this initial purification was a fleeting moment. Within hours, as hundreds of bodies plunged, splashed, and perspired into its depths, the water transformed. It became a murky, tepid broth, a veritable incubator for a microscopic menagerie of unseen organisms. Thomas, with his intimate proximity to the grime and the overflow, could almost feel the pulsating life teeming within the water, a secret ecosystem thriving on the shared neglect. He saw it daily, the patrons' blissful ignorance. They'd emerge from the pools, their skins slick with a mixture of water, sweat, and the residue of countless others, proclaiming renewed vigor. Ah, the waters, they'd exclaim, slapping their chests with satisfaction, their faces flushed with what they mistook for healthy exertion. I feel a new man. Thomas, meanwhile, would be surreptitiously disposing of a crumpled, sodden cloth that had been shared amongst a half-dozen men, or carefully sweeping away clumps of hair and what he suspected were less savory effluvia that had detached themselves from the bodies of his fellow bathers. His own skin bore the constant testament to the environment, a perpetual rash. A dry, itchy landscape of inflamed pores seemed to have taken up permanent residence on his arms and neck. His fingertips, perpetually waterlogged from his ceaseless duties, were soft and often peeling, prone to nicks and cuts that festered in the humid air. He often felt like a soggy biscuit, on the verge of disintegrating. The communal sponges, those rough, porous things that passed from hand to hand, from groin to armpit, were a particular source of quiet horror. They were never truly cleaned, merely squeezed out and tossed aside. Their microscopic passengers undoubtedly passed along with the next scrub. He'd watched a portly merchant, his face ruddy and his breath reeking of wine, vigorously scrub his entire body with one of these abused sponges, oblivious to the fact that it had just been used by a gaunt man who'd been coughing violently into his cupped hand mere moments before. The merchant emerged with a smug smile, declaring himself invigorated, while Thomas felt a cold dread creep up his spine, imagining the invisible transit of illness. It was a gamble, this bathhouse experience, a roll of the dice with one's own health, and the patrons, in their pursuit of fleeting comfort, seemed to be betting heavily against themselves. He recalled one particularly unpleasant afternoon. A man, his skin already mottled and his breathing ragged, had insisted on a long, deep soak. He'd emerged from the water visibly weaker, his eyes glassy, and had stumbled out of the bathhouse with a hacking cough that echoed through the steamy halls. Thomas, later tasked with draining and cleaning one of the smaller, less used pools, had found a disturbing amount of cloudy sediment clinging to the bottom, a visible testament to the ailing man's passage. He'd scraped it away with a worn out brush, the foul smelling residue clinging stubbornly to the stone, and had felt a profound sense of resignation. There was no point in trying to disinfect what was inherently designed for contamination. The very design of the place, the constant flow and overflow, the shared materials, the sheer volume of humanity, all worked in concert to create an environment where disease could flourish like fungi after a heavy rain. The irony wasn't lost on Thomas. Men came here seeking respite, seeking to shed the grime of the streets and the weariness of their labors, only to often leave with a new, more insidious burden. They spoke of the therapeutic properties of the waters, of the minerals that supposedly rejuvenated the body, of the steam that opened the pores and cleansed the spirit. Thomas, however, saw the reality: the stagnant water, the shared cloths, the unwashed sponges, and the growing list of patrons who seemed to enter the bathhouse hale and hearty, only to leave with a fever, a cough, or a persistent rash. It was a bizarre ritual, this pursuit of well being through a conduit of potential sickness. He would sometimes stand by the water's edge, the heat and the humidity pressing in on him, and watch the oblivious dance of the patrons. They'd splash each other, laugh boisterously, and indulge in the simple pleasures of warmth and company, all while swimming in a soup of their collective emanations. A child, no older than 5, happily splashed with his father, his little hands gripping a shared sponge that had seen better days, its once vibrant color now a dull, indeterminate hue. Thomas winced. He imagined the invisible tendrils of sickness reaching out, latching onto the child's innocent flesh. The father, beaming with pride at his son's apparent joy, would no doubt attribute any subsequent sniffles or coughs to the changeable weather, never to the very waters that were supposed to be his salvation. Even the very act of drying oneself offered little respite. The communal towels, thick and absorbent, but rarely, if ever, laundered, were passed from one patron to the next. Thomas had seen the same towel used to dry a sweating laborer, then a pale, delicate gentleman, and finally a woman with a hacking cough, all within the span of a single hour. The threads themselves seemed to absorb and retain the essence of every body they touched, becoming a tapestry of shared human frailty. He'd sometimes find himself meticulously folding these damp, musty cloths, his stomach churning, his mind conjuring images of the microscopic life teeming within their absorbent fibers. He'd often wonder if the slight chill that seemed to settle in his bones after a long day was merely from the damp air, or if it was the creeping tendrils of the infirmities he was forced to witness and, in a way, facilitate. His own physical ailments were a constant nagging reminder of the bathhouse's true nature. The persistent rash was an infuriating itch that he could never quite satisfy, a testament to the constant exposure to moisture and whatever irritants it carried. His fingers, perpetually soft and pruned, felt clumsy and unresponsive, their skin often cracked and bleeding, a perfect entry point for any unwelcome microbial visitors. He'd often catch himself staring at his hands, wondering if they were truly his own, or merely extensions of the pervasive damp and grime that defined his existence. They were the hands of a bathhouse attendant, hands that had touched more grime and more shared bodies than he cared to admit, hands that were probably as unhygienic as the very water he served. There were moments, fleeting and rare, when a patron would emerge from the baths looking genuinely revitalized, their skin glowing, their step a lighter. Thomas attributed these instances to sheer luck, or perhaps a robust constitution that could shrug off the inherent dangers of the establishment. More often than not, however, the patron's glow was a temporary flush, a superficial veneer that masked a deeper vulnerability. They emerged invigorated, yes, but also subtly changed, their bodies now a little more open, a little more susceptible to the myriad ailments that lurked just beneath the surface of everyday life. They were, in essence, participating in a grand, communal experiment in biological transference, all in the name of a perceived and often illusory sense of well being. Thomas, the silent observer, the unwitting participant, could only watch and continue his endless, futile task of trying to maintain an illusion of order in a world that reveled in its own delightful chaos. The steam, he mused, was a powerful anesthetic, numbing the senses to the truth of the squalor, making a noble delusions of hygiene a perfectly acceptable way to live. The great oak doors groaned shut, a final mournful exhalation that sealed the bathhouse for the night. The last echoes of boisterous laughter and the wet slap of skin against damp stone faded, leaving behind an eerie quiet, broken only by the persistent drip of condensation from the vaulted ceiling and the soft hiss of escaping steam. Thomas stood amidst the wreckage of the day's revelry, a lone sentinel in the cavernous, humid aftermath. His muscles screamed in protest, a dull, persistent throb that had become as familiar as the perpetually damp chill clinging to his clothes. Every joint felt stiff, every breath heavy with the cloying scent of stale water, sweat, and the faint, sickly sweetness of cheap perfume left behind by a patron eager to impress. His wages, a pittance in comparison to the Herculean effort he expended, barely afforded him a cramped corner to sleep in, and a diet that consisted mostly of bread and thin gruel. He surveyed the scene with a weary resignation. Discarded towels lay in sodden heaps like fallen soldiers, their once pristine fabric now stained with the effluvia of 100 bodies. Wooden clogs were scattered haphazardly, testament to the sudden urgency with which patrons sought to escape the pervasive damp. The air, thick and heavy, seemed to cling to him, a damp shroud that mirrored the weariness etched into his very bones. He kicked absently at a discarded sponge, a small, grayish lump that had seen too many scrubbings, too many intimate encounters with the flesh of strangers. It was a monument to the pervasive, unacknowledged squalor he navigated daily. Yet, in this desolate stillness, a peculiar form of solace began to seep in. It wasn't the comforting warmth of the waters, nor the fleeting pleasure of a clean body, but something far more profound, far more real, the shared burden of his fellow attendants. They were a motley crew, bound not by friendship, but by the shared indignity of their profession. There was Silas, his face perpetually etched with a grimace that spoke of chronic indigestion and a lifetime of disappointment. He was the one who tirelessly polished the brass fixtures until they gleamed, a futile attempt to impose order on the inherent chaos. Then there was young Finn, barely more than a boy, his youthful energy already leached away by the relentless demands of the bathhouse, his hands raw and chapped from wrestling with heavy water buckets. And finally, old Barnaby, his back permanently stooped, his breath catching in ragged wheezes, who seemed to possess an uncanny ability to predict which patrons would cause the most trouble and to disappear accordingly. They rarely spoke of their grievances in full, their complaints distilled into grunts, shared glances, and the occasional whispered curse under their breath. But Thomas felt their silent solidarity, a tacit understanding that transcended words. As they went about their final, perfunctory tasks, emptying basins, sweeping away debris, stoking the dying embers of the furnaces, their movements were synchronized, a choreography of exhaustion. A shared look between Silas and Thomas as they wrestled with a particularly stubborn drain could convey volumes. A mixture of disgust, frustration, and a grim acknowledgement of their shared fate. Sometimes, late at night, after the last patron had departed and the doors were bolted, a small, illicit gathering would form in the dimly lit service corridors. It was here, amidst the shadows and the ever present damp, that their true camaraderie flickered to life. A crust of bread, pilfered from the kitchens, or slipped to them by a sympathetic, albeit often drunken patron, would be passed around. A jug of wine, carelessly left behind, or discreetly acquired from a carelessly stored supply, would make its rounds. These were not acts of outright thievery, but rather a desperate clawing for dignity, a small rebellion against the oppressive weight of their existence. "Did you see old Fitzwilliam today?" Silas would begin, his voice raspy, a hint of amusement in his usually dour tone. "Practically swam in the saffron oil. I swear, the entire pool smelled like a spice market gone mad." Finn, his young face still smudged with grime, would chime in with a nervous giggle, recounting a near miss with a particularly irate gentleman who had lost his favorite comb. "Thought he'd have my hide," Finn would whisper, his eyes wide. "But I told him it must have sunk into the drain. He seemed to believe it, bless his oblivious soul." Thomas would listen, a wry smile playing on his lips. He'd contribute his own anecdotes, tales of patrons who insisted on carrying on lengthy, booming conversations while submerged, or those who emerged from the steam room with skin so flushed it looked like it might ignite. They'd dissect the day's peculiar events, their shared experiences transforming the mundane into a tapestry of dark humor. The bathhouse, a place of such profound grime and potential for illness became, in these stolen moments, a stage for their own twisted comedy. That woman with the elaborate coiffure, Barnaby would croak, referring to a regular patron who seemed to coat her hair in a prodigious amount of grease and flower petals, left enough of her pomade in the water to lubricate a cartwheel. I swear, I saw a fish try to swim through it. A ripple of laughter would pass through the small group. It was a fragile thing, this laughter, born of exhaustion and a desperate need to find levity in the bleakness. It was the sound of men pushing back, however feebly, against the relentless tide of their circumstances. They were the unseen gears in the great steaming engine of the bathhouse, unseen and largely unappreciated, but they kept the mechanism turning. These moments, brief and fleeting as they were, provided a crucial ballast against the crushing weight of their reality. They were a reminder that they were not alone in their suffering, that others shared their Sisyphean task. It was a kinship forged in the shared scent of damp wool and body odor, in the shared ache of tired muscles, and in the shared unspoken understanding that tomorrow would bring little relief. As they dispersed, melting back into the shadows of their meager quarters, a quiet understanding passed between them. The pilfered bread, the diluted wine, the shared jokes. These were not mere trifles. They were the fuel that allowed them to face another dawn, another onslaught of steam and squalor. They were the silent acknowledgement that even in the most dehumanizing of environments, the human spirit, in its own peculiar, resilient way, could find moments of solace, moments of connection, moments that made the endless grind just a little more bearable. And as Thomas finally lay down on his straw-filled mattress, the dampness seeping into his bones, he found a strange comfort in the knowledge that the shared grumbles of his fellow attendants were the last sounds he heard before sleep, a promise that the fight, however futile, was a shared one. The persistent dampness of the bathhouse was more than just an aesthetic inconvenience. It was a creeping, insidious enemy that waged a silent war on the attendants' bodies. The very air, thick with the exhalations of countless bathers and the effluvium of various cleaning agents, felt like a damp shroud, chilling the bone and breeding a hacking cough that became the unofficial anthem of the bathhouse staff. Thomas felt it in his own chest, a dry tickle that deepened into a rasping cough in the pre-dawn hours, a constant reminder of the environment's corrosive touch. It was a malady that seemed to settle into the lungs, a tenacious visitor that refused to be expelled, whispering promises of future respiratory torment. The steam, so often invoked as a symbol of cleansing and rejuvenation for the patrons, was for those who toiled within its embrace a perpetual breeding ground for sickness. The slickness of the flagstone floors was a more immediate and dramatic threat. A moment's inattention, a misplaced footfall, and one could find themselves sprawled amongst the scattered refuse of the day, a symphony of bone-jarring impact and the ignominious splash of spilled water. Thomas had witnessed it countless times. Silas, usually so deliberate in his movements, had once taken a particularly spectacular tumble while carrying a heavy bucket of hot water. The resulting cascade had drenched him from head to foot, the scalding liquid stinging his skin and the sudden jolt leaving him breathless and wincing. He'd managed a weak, watery grin, muttering about the grease of the gods being more slippery than any soap, but the purple bruise that bloomed on his hip served as a stark reminder of the floor's treacherous nature. Even the seemingly innocuous act of fetching a dropped towel could become a perilous undertaking, a dance with gravity on a surface that offered no purchase. The small, often overlooked puddles that gathered in the nooks and crannies, formed by condensation and careless splashing, were miniature traps waiting to ensnare the unwary. These were not mere annoyances. They were opportunities for twisted ankles, fractured limbs, and the ignominy of being laid low by a few inches of lukewarm, vaguely soapy water. The attendants learned to navigate the labyrinthine corridors with a cautious gait, their eyes constantly scanning the floor, a grim ballet of avoidance and survival. Beyond the immediate threat of a slip or a fall, the more insidious dangers lurked, slowly eroding the attendant's health. The constant exposure to moisture, coupled with the abrasive nature of the cleaning materials, had left Thomas's hands in a sorry state. His knuckles were perpetually red and swollen, the skin cracked and fissured, stinging with every contact with water, no matter how brief. The lye soap, a necessary evil for cutting through the grime and grease, felt like a slow acid, stripping away the natural oils and leaving his skin raw and vulnerable. He'd tried various salves and balms, often made from humble herbs pilfered from the apothecary's discarded scraps, but nothing offered lasting relief. The cracks would heal only to reopen with the next day's labor, a constant, throbbing testament to the brutal demands placed upon his flesh. He'd seen the same affliction on the hands of his colleagues, a shared badge of their occupation, as if their very skin bore witness to the relentless scrubbing and exposure. The water itself, often shared and inadequately filtered, was a vector for far more troubling ailments. Skin infections, small but persistent irritations that could fester and spread, were common. A rash that started as a minor itch could quickly bloom into weeping sores, a constant source of discomfort and a potential gateway for more serious infections. There were whispers, too, of more profound illnesses, born from the accumulated filth and the close proximity to so many bodies, some of them undoubtedly carrying unseen contagions. Fevers would sweep through the staff with alarming regularity, leaving men weak and delirious, their bodies ravaged by an invisible enemy. Thomas remembered young Finn, his youthful exuberance dimmed by a relentless fever that had kept him confined to his cot for a week, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. When he'd finally returned, his cheeks were hollow, his eyes sunken, and his hands trembled as he attempted to wring out a towel. The bathhouse, with its promise of warmth and cleanliness for the privileged few, was a breeding ground for sickness for those who served it. The strain on their backs and limbs was another constant, unacknowledged burden. The endless scrubbing, the lifting of heavy buckets, the contorting of their bodies to reach awkward spaces, it all took its toll. Barnaby, with his permanently stooped posture, was a living monument to the cumulative effect of this physical abuse. His movements were slow and deliberate, each step accompanied by a soft groan. He'd once confided in Thomas, his voice a dry rustle of leaves, that he could no longer recall a time when his back didn't ache. It was a dull, constant throb, a companion that followed him even in his sleep. Thomas felt the familiar tightness in his own lower back, a warning sign that he, too, was slowly being worn down by the relentless physical demands. The very act of standing for hours on end, often in water, put a strain on his feet and legs, a weariness that seeped into his very bones. The warmth of the bathhouse, so inviting to the patrons, was a deceptive solace to the attendants. It masked the underlying vulnerability, the constant erosion of their physical well being. It was a place where the body was simultaneously indulged and exploited, where the very elements that promised rejuvenation for some were the slow instruments of decay for others. The attendants were, in essence, living on the fringe of the patron's comfort, their own health a secondary concern, easily sacrificed on the altar of public sanitation and pleasure. The warmth was a lie, a gilded cage that held them captive, while it slowly, insidiously began to break them down, one ache, one cough, one cracked knuckle at a time. The bathhouse, for all its steaming allure, was a crucible where tempers could ignite as readily as the embers beneath the boilers. While the majority of patrons sought solace and cleanliness, a volatile minority treated the attendants not as servants, but as punching bags for their frustrations, their boorishness, and their sheer, unadulterated malice. Thomas had seen it all, from the entitled sniff of a wealthy merchant, bemoaning a lukewarm rinse, to the guttural threats of a dock worker who'd had too much to drink. He'd learned, with a speed that surprised even himself, that survival in this steaming labyrinth wasn't just about the grease on the floors or the damp in the air. It was about the volatile nature of humanity, amplified by the intimate, vulnerable setting of the baths. The most common breed of trouble, Thomas had observed, was the man whose ego was as bloated as his belly. These were the ones who would linger, demanding extra attention, a hotter towel, a more vigorous scrub, their voices laced with an imperceptible sneer. They saw the attendants as extensions of their own privilege, objects to be commanded and discarded at will. A sharp word, a perceived lack of deference, could turn a mildly irritating patron into a simmering threat. Thomas had cultivated a practiced smile, a humble nod, and a voice that remained maddeningly placid. He'd learned to anticipate the subtle shifts in posture, the tightening of a jaw, the glint in an eye that signaled an impending storm. His skill wasn't in confronting, but in diffusing. It was a delicate dance, a constant assessment of energy, a silent negotiation of boundaries. He'd mastered the art of appearing attentive while mentally charting the quickest exit, of offering a soothing platitude while his senses were on high alert for any hint of aggression. Then there were the soldiers, fresh from the grimy realities of barracks life, or worse, from the battlefield itself. They brought with them a raw, untamed energy. Their camaraderie, often boisterous and crude, could easily spill over into something darker, a lost wager, a perceived insult from a fellow soldier, or simply the lingering tension of their profession could find an outlet in the bathhouse. Thomas remembered one particularly unpleasant evening when a unit, flush with their meager pay, had descended upon the baths. The air, already thick with steam, became charged with the metallic tang of their cheap ale and the thunder of their laughter. One of them, a hulking brute with a face like a badly mended sail, had taken offense at another attendant's inability to keep up with his demands for hot water. The soldier, fueled by drink and a soldier's ingrained aggression, had grabbed the attendant's arm with a vice-like grip. The attendant, a wiry youth named Finn, yelped in pain, his face contorting. Before anyone could react, the soldier shoved him hard. Finn stumbled backward, his feet finding no purchase on the perpetually slick tiles. He went down with a sickening thud, his head cracking against the stone edge of a wash basin. The subsequent chaos was swift and brutal. The soldier, his eyes wild, had then turned his attention to anyone who dared to look his way, his fists clenched, his posture a clear invitation to a fight. In moments like these, Thomas's spatial awareness became his most valuable weapon. He knew the bathhouse not just as a workplace, but as a miniature warren. He knew which alcoves offered the best concealment, which narrow corridors could funnel an attacker into a choke point, and which back exits were rarely used. He'd learned to read the body language of a brewing conflict, to recognize the subtle tells that signaled a patron was about to go from belligerent to outright violent. It was a grim calculus, a constant assessment of risk. When a patron's voice began to boom, when their gestures became wider and more aggressive, when their eyes lost their focus and narrowed with a primal intensity, Thomas knew it was time to fade. He wouldn't confront. Confrontation was for fools and martyrs. His goal was not to win a fight, but to avoid being in one. This meant a swift, almost invisible withdrawal, a sudden distraction, a dropped towel, a feigned stumble in the opposite direction, anything to break the patron's focus and create an opening for escape. He'd perfected the art of the non-confrontational retreat, of melting into the steam and the shadows. He remembered a night when a particularly large and surly patron, reeking of cheap liquor and desperation, had taken exception to the way Thomas had handed him his rough linen towel. The patron had snarled, his face a mask of drunken fury, and lunged forward, his fist raised. Thomas, anticipating the move an instant before it happened, had dropped the towel at the man's feet, simultaneously ducking low. The patron's momentum carried him forward, his fist whistling through the empty air where Thomas's head had been a moment before. While the man reeled from his own overreach, Thomas had already slipped behind a large pillar, then through a narrow service doorway, emerging into the relative quiet of the back corridors. He waited there for a good 10 minutes, his heart hammering against his ribs, listening to the muffled sounds of shouting and the occasional clang of metal on stone from the main bathing hall. When silence finally returned, broken only by the persistent drip of water, he emerged, his face carefully composed, ready to face whatever new hazard the night might bring. This wasn't bravery, he told himself. It was self-preservation. It was the cold, hard logic of survival in a world that offered little protection. He'd seen the consequences of misjudgment, of standing one's ground against overwhelming force. He'd seen attendants with broken noses, cracked ribs, and the lingering fear in their eyes that made them jump at every loud noise. His own survival depended on a finely tuned awareness, a constant, almost instinctive reading of the room. He learned to recognize the subtle cues that indicated a patron was not just unhappy, but actively dangerous. It was in the way their eyes scanned the room, as if looking for an audience for their rage. It was in the way their muscles tensed, ready to spring. It was in the low growl that vibrated in their chest, a sound that spoke of primal instincts taking over. He also learned that a timely apology, even for something that wasn't his fault, could be a powerful shield. If a patron was loudly complaining and their complaint was directed at him, A simple, "My apologies, sir, I'll attend to it immediately," delivered in a soft, deferential tone, could often de escalate the situation. It fed their ego, acknowledged their perceived authority, and bought him precious seconds. He would then move with a renewed urgency, ensuring whatever they demanded was done quickly and efficiently, thereby removing the immediate cause for their ire. It was a performance, a carefully constructed role of the perfect, unobtrusive servant. But behind the meek facade, his mind was always racing, always calculating, always ready to disengage. The drunken soldier, however, was a different caliber of threat altogether. Their aggression was often less about a specific grievance and more about an unmoored rage, a violent overflow of pent up frustrations. They were often armed, even when off duty, with the implicit threat of a bayonet or a sturdy cudgel. When such a patron entered, Thomas would instinctively catalog their demeanor. A loud voice, unsteady gait, and belligerent stare were all red flags. If they began to draw attention for the wrong reasons, his primary objective shifted from service to evasion. He would deliberately avoid eye contact, keep his movements fluid and unobtrusive, and ensure he was never alone with such an individual for any extended period. If he saw trouble brewing, he wouldn't hesitate to create a minor diversion elsewhere, perhaps accidentally knocking over a bucket of water in a less populated area, drawing the attention of other staff or, ideally, the patron themselves away from the volatile situation. The bathhouse, in its very essence, was a place of vulnerability. Patrons shed not just their clothes, but often their inhibitions, their politeness, their very civility. For the attendants, this vulnerability was a constant risk. They were the silent witnesses to the unvarnished selves of men from all walks of life, and sometimes those selves were ugly. Thomas had learned that the art of survival here was not about fighting back, but about anticipating, about deflecting, and about disappearing. It was about being so insubstantial, so readily available yet so elusive, that the wrath of the impatient, the drunk, or the simply cruel would pass him by, like a summer storm that raged but ultimately moved on, leaving the landscape, if not entirely unscathed, then at least standing. His ability to melt into the background, to become one with the ever present steam and the echoing sounds of the bathhouse, was his most formidable defense. He was a ghost in the machine, a silent observer, and his greatest victory was simply making it through each shift without becoming a casualty of another man's fury. He had to be everywhere and nowhere, a shadow that served, a presence that could vanish at a moment's notice. This was the hustle, the constant nerve-wracking vigilance that underpinned the supposed tranquility of the baths, a silent battle waged not with fists, but with awareness and the desperate primal urge to simply endure. The ever-present steam, usually a comforting blanket, also served as a conspiratorial veil, muffling the hushed tones of secrets being exchanged. Thomas, perpetually moving between the steaming rooms and the cooler alcoves, found himself privy to a constant, swirling current of information, a veritable torrent of whispers and confidences that flowed as freely as the hot water. The bathhouse, it seemed, was not just a sanctuary for the flesh, but a breeding ground for rumor, a veritable exchange where reputations were bought, sold, and tarnished with equal ease. He was an attendant, a cleaner, a server of needs, but he was also, by sheer proximity, an unwitting recipient of the city's unspoken confessions and its most salacious tidbits. He learned to develop a remarkable selective hearing, an ability to filter out the mundane chatter about the weather or the price of grain, and to latch onto the threads of gossip that held any real weight. A nobleman, his voice lowered to a conspiratorial murmur as he leaned close to a trusted companion, might speak of a certain countess's indiscretions, detailing clandestine meetings in darkened alleys and the exchange of more than just whispered endearments. Thomas, while ostensibly polishing a brass fitting or adjusting a steaming towel, would absorb these fragments, filing them away with a dispassionate efficiency. These were not tales to be savored, but data points, pieces of a complex, often treacherous social tapestry that he navigated daily. He understood, with a chilling clarity, that this knowledge was a potent and often dangerous form of currency. Then there were the merchants, their faces slick with a combination of sweat and self importance. Their conversations were often tinged with suspicion and avarice, their whispers laced with talk of inflated contracts, pilfered goods, and the careful cultivation of influential patrons. One particularly portly gentleman, his belly straining the buttons of his waistcoat, was overheard grumbling about a business partner who had conveniently lost a shipment of silk in transit, conveniently just before a hefty payment was due. Thomas, his hands busy wrestling with a particularly stubborn patch of grime on the marble floor, caught the glint in the man's eye, a flicker of something that spoke of more than just financial loss. It hinted at betrayal, at a carefully orchestrated deceit. These were the whispers that could lead to downfall, to public disgrace, or worse, to the sharp sting of a blade in a dark corner. The city guard, too, brought their own brand of rumor, their conversations often a mix of boastful accounts of minor arrests and grumbled complaints about the lack of proper recognition for their services. They spoke of bribes offered and accepted, of petty corruption that festered within the ranks, and of the general inefficiency that plagued their patrols. Thomas heard them bemoaning the leniency shown to certain well-connected individuals and the heavy-handedness with which others, less fortunate, were treated. He learned to distinguish the genuine grievances from the self-serving excuses, and to note the names of those who seemed to hold particular sway, or conversely, those who were particularly disliked. This was vital information, a map of the city's underbelly, a guide to who held power, and more importantly, who was vulnerable to its machinations. His role, in these instances, was that of the silent conduit, the ever present, yet largely invisible, witness. He could not betray any sign of interest, no matter how juicy the morsel of gossip. A lingering glance, a subtle tilt of the head, anything that suggested he was more than just a humble attendant, could mark him as a potential informant, or worse, a liability. He had to cultivate an aura of utter neutrality, his gaze politely unfocused, his demeanor one of passive acquiescence. His livelihood depended on his ability to blend into the background, to be as unobtrusive as the steam itself, absorbing the sonic detritus of the city without ever acknowledging its significance. This constant influx of information, however, began to shape his understanding of the bathhouse, and indeed of the city itself. He saw the delicate balance of power, the intricate web of favors and debts, the subtle machinations that governed the lives of its inhabitants. He learned which patrons were to be treated with the utmost deference, not just because of their apparent wealth, but because of the dangerous connections they possessed. A whispered word from a seemingly minor official, for instance, could have far reaching consequences, and Thomas made it his business to know who those officials were. He also learned to identify those who were outwardly powerful but secretly vulnerable, their secrets a potential lever for those who knew how to pull it. The bathhouse, in this regard, became a microcosm of the city's wider social and political landscape. The same undercurrents of ambition, deception, and fragile alliances that played out in the guild halls and the lord's chambers were also present, albeit in a more diluted, often more salacious form, amidst the steam and the echoing water. Thomas, by simply performing his duties, was gaining an education that no formal schooling could provide. He was learning the unwritten rules, the unspoken threats, and the hidden desires that drove the men who frequented the baths. He had to be careful, though. The very act of listening, of absorbing these confidences, carried its own risks. A careless word overheard, a misplaced piece of information, could inadvertently expose him. He recalled one incident where a particularly boisterous group of city guardsmen were engaged in a heated debate about a recent crackdown on illegal gambling dens. One of them, clearly in his cups, boasted about how his unit had been tipped off about a particular establishment, implying a leak from within the constabulary itself. Thomas focused on ensuring the water was at the perfect temperature, had absorbed the muttered name of a certain sergeant known for his discreet dealings. Weeks later, he overheard the same sergeant complaining bitterly about a sudden and highly inconvenient transfer to a remote outpost. Thomas could only surmise that his overheard snippet, passed along through the bathhouse grapevine, had somehow contributed to the sergeant's misfortune. It was a stark reminder that even passive listening could have active consequences. The whispers, therefore, were not merely idle chatter. They were potential weapons, veiled threats, and the currency of influence. Thomas learned to compartmentalize, to hear without reacting, to retain without revealing. He developed an almost preternatural ability to appear completely engrossed in his tasks, his mind a steel vault for the information that was so carelessly shared around him. He understood that a misplaced sigh of surprise or a widening of the eyes could be interpreted as comprehension, and comprehension could lead to suspicion. His face had to remain a mask of placid service, his expressions as blank as the polished stone walls. He also learned to recognize the subtle cues that indicated a patron was about to reveal something significant. It wasn't always the hushed tones. Sometimes it was a sudden lull in the conversation, a palpable shift in the atmosphere, or a deliberate scanning of the surroundings to ensure no unwanted ears were present. When these signs manifested, Thomas would instinctively lower his gaze, his movements becoming even more minimal, almost imperceptible. He would focus on the mundane, on the practicalities of his job, letting the steam and the ambient noise of the bathhouse do the work of obscuring his presence. The constant exposure to this unfiltered dialogue also began to erode some of his earlier assumptions about the city's elite. He saw the cracks in their polished facades, the insecurities beneath their pronouncements of authority, and the often petty squabbles that drove their actions. It was a messy, human business, this governance and commerce, far removed from the idealized portrayals that might be found in illuminated manuscripts. And he, a humble attendant, was getting an uncensored look behind the curtain. His survival, he realized, was intricately linked to his ability to navigate this treacherous landscape of whispered confidences, knowing whom to appease, whom to avoid, and whom to simply ignore was as vital as mastering the art of scrubbing away stubborn grime. It was a constant, low level hum of vigilance, a second nature developed through necessity. The bathhouse, with its steamy embrace and echoing halls, was not just a place of physical cleansing, but a crucible for social maneuvering, a silent war waged with words and reputations. And Thomas, the quiet attendant, was learning to be a surprisingly effective soldier in this unseen conflict, armed with nothing but his silence and his keen, ever watchful ears. He understood that the most valuable lessons weren't always shouted. Sometimes they were merely breathed into the humid air, waiting for a discreet listener to catch them. He was that listener, and in his silence lay his strength, the ability to absorb the city's secrets without ever revealing his own was perhaps his greatest asset in this steam-filled arena. The opulent steam rooms, with their polished marble and the intoxicating scent of lavender and pine, were not merely spaces for a public cleanse. For those in the know, the bathhouse pulsed with a secondary economy, a discreet undercurrent of commerce that flowed as surely as the perpetually heated water. It was a realm of hushed negotiations, of furtive exchanges conducted with a practiced nonchalance that belied the true nature of the transactions. This was the black market, the shadow economy woven into the very fabric of the bathhouse, and Thomas, with his precarious existence, found himself increasingly drawn into its intricate and often dangerous tendrils. It began subtly, as most things of this nature did. A whispered inquiry here, a knowing glance there. The constant throng of patrons, from the stinking masses seeking a semblance of cleanliness to the perfumed elite flaunting their wealth, provided an endless supply of opportunities. Thomas, with his access to the labyrinthine corridors, the storerooms brimming with unused linens, and the very plumbing that supplied the city's most revered cleansing establishment, was uniquely positioned. His status as an attendant, a shadow flitting between the steaming chambers and the cooler antechambers, rendered him almost invisible to the transactions he facilitated. The most common commodity traded in this clandestine bazaar was access, a private tub with its guaranteed privacy and personal attendant, albeit one paid extra for their discretion, was a luxury many wealthy patrons craved. For a generous tip, Thomas could ensure a specific room remained unoccupied for a designated period, or subtly steer away inquiring patrons with fabricated tales of plumbing malfunctions or ongoing maintenance. These arrangements were rarely spoken aloud, communicated through pre-arranged signals, a certain arrangement of towels, or a specific phrase delivered with an innocent smile. Thomas learned to read the subtle cues, the barely perceptible nods, the way a hand might linger on a shoulder, indicating a desire for exclusivity. He discovered that a strategically placed coin, slipped into his palm during the supposedly routine refilling of a water basin, could buy an hour of unparalleled privacy in the largest, most opulent steam room, the one with the mosaic depicting the goddess of cleansing herself. It was a small thing, but in the constant struggle for survival, every extra coin, every earned favor, was a bulwark against the gnawing hunger and the biting cold. Beyond mere access, there was the matter of spirits. The city, in its infinite wisdom, deemed alcohol a luxury, taxed to the point of near prohibition for the common folk. Yet, the patrons of the bathhouse, accustomed to a life of ease and indulgence, often found their evenings incomplete without a dram of something stronger than water. Thomas, having observed the discreet stashes of sealed flasks brought in by certain favored customers, began to notice a pattern. These patrons, with their expensive rings and their silk robes, would often leave their empty vessels behind, tucked away in private lockers, only to retrieve them later, their thirst quenched, their secret kept. It didn't take long for Thomas to realize that the bathhouse's own stores, while officially prohibiting any alcohol, were not as vigilantly guarded as they might have been. A few well placed bribes to other attendants, those who shared his desperation, and he found himself with a small but steady supply of illicit spirits, cheap wine pilfered from a merchant's warehouse, or even stronger, more potent concoctions brewed in clandestine stills in the city's underbelly. He'd then discreetly offer these to patrons who seemed particularly parched. The markup was astronomical, of course. A single cup of watered down wine, procured for a pittance, could fetch him enough to buy a decent meal for 2 days. It was a morally gray area, he knew, but the gnawing emptiness in his stomach was a far more immediate and potent motivator than any abstract ethical consideration. Then there were the messages. The bathhouse, with its steady flow of individuals from all walks of life, became an inadvertent postal service. Important communiques, discreet invitations, even coded threats were passed through the hands of the attendants. Thomas, with his ability to blend into the background, became an adept courier. He'd receive a folded piece of parchment, no larger than his thumb, tucked into the folds of a towel or slipped into the pocket of a discarded robe. His task was simple: to deliver it to the intended recipient without drawing attention. He learned to recognize the patrons who used this service, the ones who lingered a little too long in a particular alcove, the ones whose eyes darted nervously around the room as they waited. He developed a system of subtle acknowledgments, a flick of the wrist, a particular way of arranging the steam canisters to indicate that the message had been received and would be delivered. The rewards varied: a few extra coins, a piece of fruit, or sometimes a promise of future patronage, a vague but potent assurance that could prove invaluable in the uncertain future. He'd once delivered a message that simply read, "The falcon flies at midnight," to a stern-faced man in the wealthiest bathing chamber. The man had merely grunted in response, pressing a small, intricately carved ivory charm into Thomas's hand. Later that week, he saw the same man being publicly lauded by a city magistrate for his swift and decisive action in foiling a smuggling ring. Thomas never knew the specifics, but he knew his small part in that larger drama had been rewarded with a tangible token of gratitude, a symbol of trust in the shadowy world he was learning to navigate. He also discovered a secondary market for the bathhouse's own wares: the finely milled, scented soaps, the luxuriously soft towels, The small polished wooden combs, these were items of considerable value to those who could not afford them. Thomas, through a carefully orchestrated series of accidents, dropped soap that was too slippery to retrieve immediately, towels that were accidentally left behind in a less frequented chamber, began to acquire a small inventory of these pilfered goods. He'd then fence them on the streets, selling a bar of lavender soap for a fraction of its retail price, but enough to make a difference. The combs, particularly the ones made of polished bone, were even more sought after, fetching a respectable sum from the women who worked the brothels in the lower districts. It was a constant game of risk, of course. The head attendant, a stout man named Silas, with a perpetual scowl and eyes that missed nothing, was always on the lookout for such discrepancies. Thomas learned to be meticulous in his pilfering, to account for every item, to leave no trace. He'd learned to swap out a stolen bar of soap for an inferior, cheaper variety, or to strategically misplace towels in areas that were unlikely to be immediately searched. It was a delicate dance, a constant tightrope walk between earning his keep and risking a swift and likely brutal dismissal or worse. The most unsettling aspect of the black market, however, was the subtle undercurrent of desperation it revealed. Thomas saw men, ostensibly respectable citizens, engaging in transactions that spoke of deeper, darker needs. A furtive exchange of a small leather pouch for a few moments of privacy with another man. A whispered request for a specific, potent aphrodisiac, promising riches for the attendant who could procure it. He learned to recognize the furtive glance that signaled a desire for something illicit, a fleeting pleasure bought at a steep price. He never participated directly in these transactions, his own needs being far more fundamental: food, warmth, a roof over his head. But he was a witness, an observer of the city's hidden desires, the raw, untamed appetites that simmered beneath the veneer of civility. He saw the shame in some eyes, the defiant bravado in others, and he understood with a chilling clarity that the bathhouse, in its very nature, offered a sanctuary for those seeking to escape not just the grime of the streets, but the constraints of their own reputations and the expectations of society. His own involvement, while initially born of necessity, began to carve a new path for him. He was no longer just an attendant, a cleaner. He was becoming a facilitator, a broker, a man who understood the subtle currents of desire and the unspoken needs of the city's inhabitants. He was learning to leverage his position to turn the very architecture of the bathhouse, its steam-filled chambers and echoing halls, into his personal marketplace. He knew which patrons were prone to generosity, which were desperate for a secret kept, and which were simply looking for a fleeting, illicit pleasure. And with each transaction, each whispered deal, he felt himself becoming more adept, more cunning, more a part of the city's intricate, shadowy web. The steam, once a mere source of heat and humidity, had become a cloak for his burgeoning enterprise, a veil for the hustles that were slowly, surely becoming his livelihood. He still cleaned, he still served, but now he did so with a newfound understanding of the true value of what transpired within these steamy walls, a value measured not in clean linen or heated water, but in secrets, in desires, and in the cold, hard currency that traded hands in the shadows. The opulent steam rooms, with their polished marble and the intoxicating scent of lavender and pine were not merely spaces for a public cleanse. For those in the know, the bathhouse pulsed with a secondary economy, a discreet undercurrent of commerce that flowed as surely as the perpetually heated water. It was a realm of hushed negotiations, of furtive exchanges conducted with a practiced nonchalance that belied the true nature of the transactions. This was the black market, the shadow economy woven into the very fabric of the bathhouse, and Thomas, with his precarious existence, found himself increasingly drawn into its intricate and often dangerous tendrils. It began subtly, as most things of this nature did, a whispered inquiry here, a knowing glance there, the constant throng of patrons, from the stinking masses seeking a semblance of cleanliness to the perfumed elite flaunting their wealth, provided an endless supply of opportunities. Thomas, with his access to the labyrinthine corridors, the storerooms brimming with unused linens, and the very plumbing that supplied the city's most revered cleansing establishment, was uniquely positioned. His status as an attendant, a shadow flitting between the steaming chambers and the cooler antechambers, rendered him almost invisible to the transactions he facilitated. The most common commodity traded in this clandestine bazaar was access, a private tub with its guaranteed privacy and personal attendant, albeit one paid extra for their discretion, was a luxury many wealthy patrons craved. For a generous tip, Thomas could ensure a specific room remained unoccupied for a designated period, or subtly steer away inquiring patrons with fabricated tales of plumbing malfunctions or ongoing maintenance. These arrangements were rarely spoken aloud, communicated through pre-arranged signals, a certain arrangement of towels, or a specific phrase delivered with an innocent smile. Thomas learned to read the subtle cues, the barely perceptible nods, the way a hand might linger on a shoulder, indicating a desire for exclusivity. He discovered that a strategically placed coin slipped into his palm during the supposedly routine refilling of a water basin could buy an hour of unparalleled privacy in the largest, most opulent steam room, the one with the mosaic depicting the goddess of cleansing herself. It was a small thing, but in the constant struggle for survival, every extra coin, every earned favor was a bulwark against the gnawing hunger and the biting cold. Beyond mere access, there was the matter of spirits. The city, in its infinite wisdom, deemed alcohol a luxury, taxed to the point of near prohibition for the common folk. Yet, the patrons of the bathhouse, accustomed to a life of ease and indulgence, often found their evenings incomplete without a dram of something stronger than water. Thomas, having observed the discreet stashes of sealed flasks brought in by certain favored customers, began to notice a pattern. These patrons, with their expensive rings and their silk robes, would often leave their empty vessels behind, tucked away in private lockers, only to retrieve them later, their thirst quenched, their secret kept. It didn't take long for Thomas to realize that the bathhouse's own stores, while officially prohibiting any alcohol, were not as vigilantly guarded as they might have been. A few well-placed bribes to other attendants, those who shared his desperation, and he found himself with a small but steady supply of illicit spirits, cheap wine pilfered from a merchant's warehouse, or even stronger, more potent concoctions brewed in clandestine stills in the city's underbelly. He'd then discreetly offer these to patrons who seemed particularly parched. The markup was astronomical, of course. A single cup of watered down wine, procured for a pittance, could fetch him enough to buy a decent meal for 2 days. It was a morally gray area, he knew, but the gnawing emptiness in his stomach was a far more immediate and potent motivator than any abstract ethical consideration. Then there were the messages. The bathhouse, with its steady flow of individuals from all walks of life, became an inadvertent postal service. Important communiques, discreet invitations, even coded threats were passed through the hands of the attendants. Thomas, with his ability to blend into the background, became an adept courier. He'd receive a folded piece of parchment, no larger than his thumb, tucked into the folds of a towel or slipped into the pocket of a discarded robe. His task was simple: to deliver it to the intended recipient without drawing attention. He learned to recognize the patrons who used this service, the ones who lingered a little too long in a particular alcove, the ones whose eyes darted nervously around the room as they waited. He developed a system of subtle acknowledgments, a flick of the wrist, a particular way of arranging the steam canisters to indicate that the message had been received and would be delivered. The rewards varied: a few extra coins, a piece of fruit, or sometimes a promise of future patronage, a vague but potent assurance that could prove invaluable in the uncertain future. He'd once delivered a message that simply read, "The falcon flies at midnight," to a stern-faced man in the wealthiest bathing chamber. The man had merely grunted in response, pressing a small, intricately carved ivory charm into Thomas's hand. Later that week, he saw the same man being publicly lauded by a city magistrate for his swift and decisive action in foiling a smuggling ring. Thomas never knew the specifics, but he knew his small part in that larger drama had been rewarded with a tangible token of gratitude, a symbol of trust in the shadowy world he was learning to navigate. He also discovered a secondary market for the bathhouse's own wares: the finely milled, scented soaps, the luxuriously soft towels, the small, polished wooden combs. These were items of considerable value to those who could not afford them. Thomas, through a carefully orchestrated series of accidents, dropped soap that was too slippery to retrieve immediately, towels that were accidentally left behind in a less frequented chamber, began to acquire a small inventory of these pilfered goods. He then fenced them on the streets, selling a bar of lavender soap for a fraction of its retail price, but enough to make a difference. The combs, particularly the ones made of polished bone, were even more sought after, fetching a respectable sum from the women who worked the brothels in the lower districts. It was a constant game of risk, of course. The head attendant, a stout man named Silas, with a perpetual scowl and eyes that missed nothing, was always on the lookout for such discrepancies. Thomas learned to be meticulous in his pilfering, to account for every item, to leave no trace. He'd learned to swap out a stolen bar of soap for an inferior, cheaper variety, or to strategically misplace towels in areas that were unlikely to be immediately searched. It was a delicate dance, a constant tightrope walk between earning his keep and risking a swift and likely brutal dismissal, or worse. The most unsettling aspect of the black market, however, was the subtle undercurrent of desperation it revealed. Thomas saw men, ostensibly respectable citizens, engaging in transactions that spoke of deeper, darker needs. a furtive exchange of a small leather pouch for a few moments of privacy with another man, a whispered request for a specific, potent aphrodisiac, promising riches for the attendant who could procure it. He learned to recognize the furtive glance that signaled a desire for something illicit, a fleeting pleasure bought at a steep price. He never participated directly in these transactions, his own needs being far more fundamental: food, warmth, a roof over his head. But he was a witness, an observer of the city's hidden desires, the raw, untamed appetites that simmered beneath the veneer of civility. He saw the shame in some eyes, the defiant bravado in others, and he understood with a chilling clarity that the bathhouse, in its very nature, offered a sanctuary for those seeking to escape, not just the grime of the streets, but the constraints of their own reputations and the expectations of society. His own involvement, while initially born of necessity, began to carve a new path for him. He was no longer just an attendant, a cleaner. He was becoming a facilitator, a broker, a man who understood the subtle currents of desire and the unspoken needs of the city's inhabitants. He was learning to leverage his position to turn the very architecture of the bathhouse, its steam filled chambers and echoing halls, into his personal marketplace. He knew which patrons were prone to generosity, which were desperate for a secret kept, and which were simply looking for a fleeting, illicit pleasure. And with each transaction, each whispered deal, he felt himself becoming more adept, more cunning, more a part of the city's intricate, shadowy web. The steam, once a mere source of heat and humidity, had become a cloak for his burgeoning enterprise, a veil for the hustles that were slowly, surely becoming his livelihood. He still cleaned, he still served, but now he did so with a newfound understanding of the true value of what transpired within these steamy walls, a value measured not in clean linen or heated water, but in secrets, in desires, and in the cold, hard currency that traded hands in the shadows. But the currents of the bathhouse ran deeper, carrying with them a more personal brand of desperation, a degradation that Thomas had witnessed with a growing sense of dread. Beyond the simple bartering of favors and the illicit trade of goods, there existed a more transactional and far more chilling exchange that preyed on the very beings of the attendants themselves. Certain wealthy patrons, their faces flushed with heat and perhaps something stronger, found a peculiar amusement in the stark disparity of their stations. For them, the attendants, clad in their rough spun tunics, were not merely servants, but curiosities, playthings to be indulged. The offers, when they came, were rarely overt, never crude in their phrasing, but the implication was as thick and suffocating as the steam itself. A lingering touch, a gaze that held a little too long, a whispered suggestion of extra coin for companionship, and Thomas understood the unspoken question, the commodification of his very presence. He'd seen it happen. He'd seen boys, younger than him, their eyes hollowed with hunger and fear, succumb to the whispered promises. They'd emerge from private chambers with a faint, sickly sheen on their skin, their movements stiff, their faces carefully blanked, as if to erase the indignity. The extra coins, clutched tightly in their hands, were a meager compensation for the erosions of their dignity, a stark reminder that in this city, in this bathhouse, even a person's body could be a commodity, a currency in a desperate, unsanitary economy. Thomas recoiled from the thought, the very idea a cold dread that coiled in his gut. He was a survivor, yes, but he clung to the remnants of his self respect with a tenacity born of a deep seated fear of becoming just another chattel, another disposable object to be used and discarded. Yet the pressure was a constant gnawing force. The whispers in the corridors, the knowing smiles of those who had partaken, the sheer overwhelming need that drove so many to the brink, it all created a suffocating atmosphere. He knew the unspoken rules of this particular game, the subtle propositions that were made with a wink and a nod, the veiled invitations to share a private moment. He'd developed a sixth sense for it, a way of anticipating the advances, of deflecting them with a polite but firm refusal. He'd learned to keep his gaze lowered, to avoid lingering eye contact, to maintain a professional distance that was as much a shield as a courtesy. But there were times, particularly when the gnawing emptiness in his stomach reached a new crescendo, or when the biting winter wind seemed to penetrate to his very bones, that the temptation, the sheer desperate practicality of it, would flicker in his mind. He remembered one particularly bleak evening, the kind where the soup kitchens had run dry, and the wind howled through the city's alleys with a predatory ferocity. A wealthy merchant, his skin slick with oil and his breath heavy with wine, had cornered him in a secluded alcove. The merchant's eyes, heavy lidded and leering, had scanned Thomas with an unnerving appraisal. He'd spoken in hushed tones, his words laced with a dangerous charm, offering a sum of money that to Thomas represented a king's ransom. It was enough to buy warm boots, a week's worth of decent food, and perhaps even a sliver of hope. The merchant had gestured towards a dimly lit, private suite, his smile widening, revealing stained teeth. Thomas had felt a wave of nausea wash over him, a profound disgust for himself for even considering it, and for the man who would make such a proposition. He had managed to stammer out a refusal, a clumsy, almost panicked retreat, and had fled into the relative safety of the bustling main hall, his heart hammering against his ribs. The incident, though he had refused, had left a mark. It had exposed a vulnerability, a grim reality that his survival might at some point hinge on an act that would strip him bare in a way that no amount of steam or water ever could. He understood the cost to his dignity, the profound internal damage that such an exchange would inflict. It was a price, he felt, that was almost too high to pay, a sacrifice of the self that was more terrifying than any physical hardship. But the chilling thought that always lurked in the back of his mind, a persistent whisper in the quiet hours of the night, was that there might come a time when the hunger, the cold, the sheer unadulterated desperation would eclipse even that fear. A time when the choice would not be between indignity and survival, but between two forms of oblivion, and the price of his body would be the only currency he had left. The thought was a constant, cold companion, a phantom chill in the humid air of the bathhouse, a stark reminder of the precariousness of his existence and the myriad ways in which a person could be broken, piece by piece, in the relentless hustle of survival. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the patrons of the bathhouse, especially the wealthiest and most jaded, were not just seeking cleanliness, they were seeking an escape from the constraints of their own lives, and sometimes That escape involved the debasement of another, and Thomas, a mere attendant in their opulent world, was acutely aware that he was always on the market. The dream was a fragile thing, a clandestine whisper against the roar of the city and the ceaseless hiss of steam. Thomas harbored it in the deepest recesses of his being, a flicker of ember in the suffocating damp darkness of his days. He dreamt not of soaring to dizzying heights, nor of amassing fortunes beyond imagining. His aspirations were far more grounded, yet in their simplicity lay an immensity that set him apart from the resigned faces that shuffled through the bathhouse each day. He longed for a different life, a life that did not involve the perpetual sting of lie on his skin, the constant ache in his lower back, or the cloying scent of other people's sweat that clung to him like a second skin. He yearned for a trade that demanded more of his mind than his weary muscles, a craft that left his hands not raw and cracked, but clean and steady. The vision that most frequently occupied his waking thoughts was that of a scrivener. He imagined himself in a quiet room, bathed in the soft glow of oil lamps, the air thick with the scent of ink and parchment. He pictured the elegant curl of his own handwriting, forming words of import, of contracts and decrees, of stories spun from imagination. It was a world away from the grimy reality of scrubbing grout and polishing brass until his knuckles bled. He'd seen scribes in the marketplace, their brows furrowed in concentration, their movements precise and deliberate as they penned letters for illiterate merchants or drafted petitions for the hopeful masses. There was a dignity to their work, a sense of purpose that Thomas found himself envying with a deep, almost painful ache. Alternatively, he'd sometimes picture himself as a smith. The image was rougher, certainly, but it held its own allure. He saw the sweat beating on a muscular brow, the fierce dance of flame and hammer, the creation of something solid and useful from raw, unyielding metal. A well-forged hinge, a sturdy plowshare, even a delicately wrought iron railing. These were tangible testaments to skill and labor. It was a trade that required strength, yes, but also precision, a keen understanding of heat and temper, and the satisfaction of creating something that would endure. He'd watched the city's blacksmiths at work, their muscles rippling with each swing of the hammer, the sparks flying like miniature fireworks against the dusk. There was an honest sweat to their labor, a cleansing fire that burned away the impurities, a stark contrast to the endless, grinding humidity of the bathhouse. These were not fleeting fancies. They were the anchors that prevented his spirit from being entirely submerged by the pervasive gloom. Every spare coin, earned through meticulously executed chores, through the subtle art of the black market that was slowly becoming second nature, was squirreled away. His hoard was pathetic, a meager collection of copper and silver, hidden beneath a loose flagstone in the cramped, damp rooms he rented on the edge of the city's lower districts. The stone was cold and rough beneath his touch, and the coins, when he dared to count them by the dim light of a sputtering wick, felt impossibly heavy, each one a tiny victory against the overwhelming tide of his present existence. He measured his progress not in days or weeks, but in the slow, agonizing accumulation of these hidden treasures. A coin for a perfectly polished brass fixture, an extra few coppers for a patron who'd been particularly pleased with his discreet service. a small silver piece for delivering a message with unwavering punctuality. These were the building blocks of his deferred freedom, the tangible proof that escape, however distant, was a possibility. He would lie awake at night, the rough wool of his blanket scratching against his skin, and trace the rough edges of the coins in his mind, envisioning the day when his meager savings would finally grant him the ability to walk away, to leave the steam and the soap and the suffocating indignity behind. The dream was his shield against the soul crushing monotony, his private rebellion against the squalor. It was the only thing that made the endless scrubbing bearable, the only thing that silenced the insidious voices that whispered of his worthlessness. When a particularly demanding patron left him feeling like less than human, when the ache in his bones threatened to consume him, he would retreat into his mind to the quiet room of the scrivener or the fiery forge of the smith. He would imagine the feeling of clean paper beneath his fingertips, the satisfying clang of hammer on anvil, and the gnawing despair would recede, replaced by a fragile, tenacious hope. He learned to compartmentalize his life. By day, he was the diligent, subservient attendant, his face a mask of polite deference. He moved through the steam-filled chambers with a practiced efficiency, his eyes downcast, his interactions minimal. He was a phantom, a presence that serviced needs without leaving a mark, without drawing undue attention. But in the stolen moments, in the quiet hours before dawn, or the brief respite between shifts, the dreamer emerged. He'd pore over any scrap of paper he could find, tracing letters, practicing rudimentary sums, his mind absorbing any fragment of knowledge that might be useful in his chosen future trades. He'd observe the city's craftsmen with an almost predatory focus, memorizing their movements, the tools they used, the materials they manipulated. The bathhouse itself, in its own perverse way, provided him with an unlikely education. He saw how different classes of people interacted, how wealth dictated behavior, and how desperation could warp even the most basic human decency. He learned to read people, to discern their needs and their desires from the subtlest of cues, a nervous twitch, a guarded glance, a casual remark that belied a deeper anxiety. This keen observation, honed by years of navigating the bathhouse's complex social strata, was a skill that he knew would serve him well in any future endeavor. He understood the subtle art of negotiation, the importance of discretion, and the inherent power dynamics that governed every transaction, whether it was for a private bath or a whispered secret. His burgeoning involvement in the bathhouse's secondary economy, while fraught with its own set of perils, also served to fuel his ambition. The extra coins, though hard won, were tangible proof that he could, in fact, effect change in his circumstances. Each illicitly procured bottle of wine sold, each discreetly delivered message, each pilfered bar of soap fenced on the street, was a step, however small, towards his ultimate goal. It was a dangerous game, played on the precipice of discovery, but the rewards, however meager, were sustenance for his dream. They were the whispers of a different future, a future where he was not beholden to the whims of others, where his labor was valued, and where his hands were not perpetually stained with the grime of others' filth. He knew the risks. Silas, the head attendant, a man whose eyes seemed to possess a perpetual, predatory glint, was a constant threat. His gruff demeanor and sharp tongue were legendary, and the consequences of being caught pilfering or engaging in any unsanctioned activity were swift and severe. Thomas had witnessed the swiftness with which other attendants, caught short-changing a patron or pocketing a dropped trinket, had been summarily dismissed, often with a brutal public humiliation that served as a grim warning to the rest. But the fear of Silas, the fear of discovery, was always tempered by the greater fear of remaining trapped in his current existence, a prisoner of the steam and the soap. His ambition, therefore, was a tightly guarded secret, a private sanctuary he retreated to whenever the weight of his daily grind threatened to crush him. It was a delicate balance, maintaining the facade of the dutiful, unremarkable attendant while nurturing the flame of aspiration within. He practiced his letters on discarded scraps of paper hidden beneath his cot. He memorized the shapes of tools, the flow of water in the pipes, the intricacies of the bathhouse's heating system, not just for his job, but for the knowledge they might one day impart. He saw potential in everything, a lesson learned, a skill acquired, a coin earned. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with the very dangers he sought to escape. The city was a brutal mistress, and survival often demanded compromises that chipped away at one's very soul. But Thomas, fueled by the dream of clean hands and a steady trade, possessed a stubborn resilience. He was a survivor, yes, but he was also a dreamer, and in the suffocating confines of the bathhouse, his dreams were the only true luxury he could afford. They were his private currency, his hidden wealth, and the silent promise that one day he would emerge from the steam, washed clean, and ready to forge a new destiny. This quiet ambition, this carefully nurtured hope, was the true glimmer in the oppressive gloom, a beacon guiding him towards a life beyond the ceaseless cycle of soapsuds and servitude. He clung to it with the tenacity of a drowning man to a piece of driftwood, his every waking moment a testament to its enduring power. The dream of departure was not just a wish, it was a meticulously planned escape route, plotted in the quiet corners of his mind, funded by the coins he carefully secreted away, and sustained by a hope that refused to be extinguished by the pervasive damp and despair. He watched them, these weathered relics of the bathhouse, their forms hunched like ancient gargoyles against the perpetual damp. They were the living embodiments of his deepest fear, the specter of what he might become if his carefully constructed dreams ever faltered. Their skin, once perhaps ruddy and alive, was now pale and flaccid, perpetually clammy from years spent breathing in the thick, humid air. Their eyes, once capable of holding a spark, now held a dull, vacant sheen, as if the very essence of their spirit had been leached away, much like the grime that stubbornly clung to the bathhouse tiles. These were the older attendants, the ones who had survived the relentless churn of this life. But survival, Thomas realized with a chilling certainty, was not the same as living. Their movements were slow, labored, each step a testament to weary joints and aching muscles. They shuffled through the steamy corridors, their faces etched with a resigned fatigue that no amount of hot water could ever wash away. They were automatons, programmed for a life of servitude, their days dictated by the shrill calls of patrons and the clatter of buckets. Thomas saw in their stooped shoulders and hollowed cheeks the reflection of a future he was desperately trying to outrun. He saw the slow erosion of ambition, the quiet surrender to the crushing weight of monotony. They were the cautionary tales, whispered not in words, but in the very way they carried themselves, in the defeated slump of their posture. Their conversations, when they deigned to speak, were typically a litany of complaints, the endless scrubbing, the sting of the lie, the sheer unadulterated unpleasantness of certain patrons. But beneath the surface of these mundane grievances lay a deeper current of despair, a quiet acknowledgment of their own futility. They spoke of the bathhouse not as a place of work, but as their entire world, a universe that had somehow shrunk to encompass only these dripping walls and the ceaseless demand for cleanliness. There was no mention of futures beyond these walls, no whispered hopes of trades learned or skills honed. Their aspirations, if they had ever existed, had long since been drowned in the recurring tide of hot water and the insidious seep of despair. The most potent symbol of their resignation, for Thomas, was the ever present jug of cheap ale. It was their balm, their anesthetic, their chosen method of escape from the harsh realities of their existence. He saw them clustered in the dimly lit alcoves during their brief respites, their faces illuminated by the weak glow of oil lamps, their fingers wrapped around the cool glass. The amber liquid offered a temporary oblivion, a fleeting reprieve from the physical and mental toll of their labor. But the relief was always short lived, the harsh dawn inevitably breaking to reveal the same weary faces, the same aching bodies, the same suffocating environment. The ale, in its fleeting comfort, only served to further cement their entrapment, dulling their senses and their will to change. He observed their interactions with patrons, the practiced subservience, the carefully calibrated smiles that never quite reached their dulled eyes. There was a hollowness to their service, a lack of genuine engagement that spoke volumes. They were there to perform tasks, to fulfill a function, but the pride, the artistry, the simple human connection that could elevate even the most menial labor was absent. They were cogs in a machine, and the machine was the bathhouse itself, a monstrous entity that consumed their youth, their energy, and ultimately their very souls. This grim tableau played out before him day after day, a constant, unsettling reminder of the stakes. Each stooped figure, each glassy eyed stare, each swig of potent ale was a nail in the coffin of his own potential future. It was a future he refused to accept, a destiny he was determined to rewrite with his own hands, not merely endure. The sight of these men, these husk-like remnants of what might have once been vibrant individuals, fueled a fire within him. It was a burning, visceral need to escape, to carve out a different existence, one where his hands were not permanently stained with the grime of others, and his mind was not dulled by the ceaseless, soul-crushing routine. He would often find himself watching them from a distance, a knot of dread tightening in his stomach. He'd see old Marth, his back permanently curved like a question mark, meticulously polishing the same brass rail for the 10th time that day, his movements mechanical, his focus entirely absent. Or there was Silas, not the head attendant, but another Silas, older and even more broken, whose sole contribution seemed to be the occasional grunt of assent when addressed, his eyes perpetually scanning the floor as if searching for a lost coin that would never be found. These were not men who had simply aged, they were men who had been consumed. The steam had seeped into their bones, the lye had leached the color from their skin, and the unending cycle of service had extinguished the spark that made them individuals. He imagined his own life unfolding in the same monotonous pattern, the slow, inexorable march towards the same vacant gaze, the same aching joints, the same reliance on the numbing embrace of alcohol. It was a horrifying premonition, a vivid illustration of the abyss that lay before him if he did not maintain his vigilance, if he allowed the oppressive atmosphere of the bathhouse to extinguish the embers of his ambition. The dream of becoming a scrivener, of feeling the smooth glide of a quill across parchment, of crafting words that held meaning and purpose, became his shield against this encroaching darkness. The vision of the blacksmith's forge, the fierce heat, and the satisfying clang of hammer on metal was his testament to a life of creation, not just consumption. He saw the subtle ways they had adapted, or rather surrendered. Their vocabulary had shrunk, their interests narrowed to the immediate and the trivial. They lived for the brief respite between shifts, for the meager wages that barely kept them afloat, and for the fleeting oblivion offered by the ale. There was a profound sadness in their acceptance, a silent scream trapped within their weathered chests. They had, in essence, become part of the bathhouse, as integral and as worn as the ancient tiles and the dripping pipes. They were no longer men seeking a life. They were elements of a system, their existence defined by their function within its steamy confines. This awareness of their fate was not a source of smug superiority for Thomas, but a powerful, motivating force. He didn't pity them, not entirely, but he recognized their plight with a stark clarity that bordered on terror. He saw that their resignation was a disease, a slow contagion that could infect anyone who spent too long breathing its thick, heavy air. He resolved, in those moments of chilling observation, to actively resist its insidious spread. Every chore performed with meticulous attention, every extra coin earned through a bit of discreet bartering, every moment spent poring over a discarded scrap of paper was a defiant act against the fate that loomed so ominously. He knew that the path ahead was not paved with ease. The city was a harsh mistress, and the bathhouse, with its inherent inequities and pervasive gloom, was a particularly unforgiving crucible. But witnessing the living ghosts of the bathhouse, the men whose futures had already been decided by the relentless grind of their present, solidified his resolve. They were a stark warning, a visual manifesto of a life unlived, a spirit unfulfilled. And in their weary, resigned existence, Thomas found not only his deepest fear, but also his most potent inspiration to shatter the cycle and forge a future that was truly his own. He would not become like them. He would escape. He had to escape. The thought was a constant, burning ember, a promise he whispered to himself in the suffocating silence of the steam-filled chambers. The biting chill of dawn often seeped into the bathhouse, even before the first furnace was stoked, a damp, insidious cold that seemed to cling to the very stone. Thomas, still nursing the lingering ache in his shoulders from a night of arduous scrubbing, found himself observing the familiar procession of early risers. They were the city's early birds, those who sought a brief respite from the grime of their own trades before the day truly began. But it was not their wakefulness, that held Thomas's attention. It was the subtle nuances of their interactions, the fleeting glimpses of something beyond the transactional nature of his existence. He remembered with a peculiar clarity that often surprised him a particular Tuesday. It had been a brutally cold morning, the kind where breath plumed in thick white clouds, and the very air seemed to possess a brittle, crystalline quality. Thomas, his hands raw and stinging from the frigid water, was meticulously wiping down the entrance to the men's bathing chambers. His worn tunic offered little protection against the biting wind that snaked its way through the partially open doors. He was so engrossed in his task, his focus narrowed to the relentless battle against the persistent damp, that he almost didn't notice the man approaching. The man was a baker, a regular patron named Master Gideon, his face usually dusted with flour and creased with the benevolent worry of a man who coaxed life from dough. Today, however, his usual cheerful demeanor seemed amplified. He was carrying a small cloth-wrapped bundle. Thomas, anticipating a curt nod or perhaps a dismissive gesture, braced himself for the usual. But Master Gideon stopped, his eyes surprisingly bright, for that hour of the morning met Thomas's. "A rough morning, lad?" the baker asked, his voice a low rumble, warm like the hearth of his own shop. He didn't wait for a full answer, his gaze flicking to Thomas's chapped and reddened hands. With a slight inclination of his head, he extended the bundle. "Here, fresh from the oven, still warm." Thomas hesitated, his ingrained caution warring with a surge of something he couldn't quite name. Gifts were rare, and unsolicited kindness rarer still. He cautiously accepted the bundle. It was heavier than he expected. Untying the cloth, he discovered a thick, crusty loaf of bread, its aroma rich and yeasty, a stark contrast to the ever-present scent of damp stone and chlorine. The warmth radiating from it seeped into his chilled fingers, a sensation so welcome it was almost startling. "Thank you, Master Gideon," Thomas managed, his voice a little rough. The baker simply smiled, a genuine, unforced expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "A bit of warmth for a cold day, lad. Keeps the spirit from freezing over, eh?" He gave a final nod and then moved on, disappearing into the steamy interior of the bathhouse. Thomas stood there for a moment, the bread cradled in his hands, the warmth a tangible presence against the pervasive chill. He hadn't eaten since the previous evening's meager ration of gruel. The bread, warm and substantial, was more than just sustenance. It was a defiant assertion of his humanity in a place that often sought to strip it away. He felt a flutter in his chest, a fragile thing akin to hope. It was a small thing, a loaf of bread, but in that moment it felt like a king's ransom. He didn't eat it immediately. Instead, he tucked it carefully into his threadbare tunic, the warmth a secret comfort against his skin. He would save it, savor it. It was a reminder that even in the suffocating embrace of the bathhouse, there were individuals, not just patrons, who saw beyond the uniform and the grime. There were other moments, too, less substantial perhaps, but no less significant. A washerwoman, her face a roadmap of hard years, would sometimes catch his eye as she hauled impossibly heavy baskets of damp linen. Instead of the usual averted gaze or a sharp word about his perceived slowness, she might offer a brief, knowing smile, a flicker of shared understanding in her weary eyes. It was a silent acknowledgement of the burdens they both carried, a fleeting connection forged in the shared crucible of labor. On one particularly trying afternoon, when a particularly irate patron had hurled a string of vulgar insults at him, the washerwoman, without a word, had placed a small, smooth stone, polished by countless washes, into his hand as she passed. It was a gesture so quiet, so devoid of expectation, that it resonated deeply. He kept that stone for a long time, a tactile reminder that empathy could manifest in the most unexpected ways. Then there were the patrons, those who, by sheer luck or a momentary lapse in their usual disdain, would offer a word of encouragement. Thomas recalled a scholar, a man who frequented the bathhouse for its relative quiet in the early mornings, meticulously taking notes in a small leather-bound book. One morning, Thomas had been diligently polishing the brass fixtures near where the scholar sat. The scholar looked up from his work, his brow furrowed in thought, and then, to Thomas's surprise, he spoke. "You have a steady hand, young man," the scholar had said, his voice measured and calm, a good attribute for any craftsman, or perhaps for a scribe. Thomas had blinked, unaccustomed to such direct observation, let alone a compliment. He mumbled a thank you, his mind already racing. A scribe? The idea, though distant, had been planted, watered by this unexpected observation. The scholar had then dipped his quill back into his ink pot, returning to his work, leaving Thomas to ponder the simple yet profound words. It was a tiny seed of possibility, a hint that his own aspirations, however grand and seemingly unattainable, might not be entirely beyond the realm of possibility. Another patron, a gruff but not unkind merchant, had once observed Thomas painstakingly mending a tear in his own worn apron with a needle and thread pilfered from a forgotten sewing kit. The merchant, a burly man with hands calloused from years of handling goods, had simply grunted, but later, as he was leaving, he tossed a small, surprisingly heavy coin at Thomas's feet. It wasn't a tip for service. It felt different, more personal. Thomas picked it up. It was a silver piece, far more than Thomas usually earned in a full day's labor. He looked around, but the merchant was already gone, lost in the throng outside. The coin, he realized, was not a reward for his diligence, but perhaps an investment in his resourcefulness, a quiet acknowledgment of his struggle to maintain himself amidst the neglect. He used that coin not for ale or a momentary indulgence, but to purchase a stronger thread and a better needle, thus allowing him to continue his own repairs and to begin mending other small items for a pittance, a tiny nascent enterprise born from an act of perceived charity. These moments were like rare wildflowers pushing through cracked pavement. They were fragile, easily overlooked, but immensely significant. They were the proof, however faint, that the world outside the bathhouse, and even pockets within it, were not entirely devoid of compassion. They were the small affirmations that he was, in fact, still a person, not merely a functionary, not just another nameless cog in the bathhouse's steamy, grimy machinery. Each kind word, each shared smile, each unexpected gift was a tiny ember, carefully banked against the pervasive chill of despair. They fueled a quiet resilience, a stubborn refusal to be entirely consumed by the drudgery. They were the whispers of hope in a place that too often only echoed with the sounds of complaint and the ceaseless flow of water. And for Thomas, they were the precious, life sustaining fuel for the dreams he nurtured in the quiet corners of his mind, dreams of a life where such moments were not rare exceptions, but the very fabric of existence. They were the antithesis of the hollow eyed men he saw shuffling through the corridors, the men who had long since forgotten the possibility of kindness, the men who had succumbed to the overwhelming tide of their circumstances. These moments, however small, were his defiance. They were the silent internal victories that kept him going, that whispered to him that escape, though arduous, was not an impossibility. They were the tiny anchors that tethered him to his own sense of self, preventing the suffocating atmosphere from utterly eroding his spirit. He hoarded them, replayed them in his mind during the long, arduous shifts, letting their warmth seep into him, a counterpoint to the cold, damp reality of his existence. They were the glimmers that prevented the encroaching darkness from becoming absolute. The city, a labyrinth of damp cobblestones and shadowed alleys, breathed with a restless energy. Beneath the veneer of everyday life, the clang of hammers, the calls of street vendors, the murmur of 1,000 conversations, a fragile ecosystem pulsed. And Thomas, in his role as a bathhouse attendant, was intimately aware of the precariousness of it all. His days were spent amidst the steam and the echoing chambers, the cleansing rituals that were meant to purify, but which he increasingly suspected also held the potential for something far more sinister. He had always lived with a hum of anxiety, a low-grade thrum beneath the surface of his existence, a constant, unspoken fear of the unforeseen catastrophe. It wasn't a dramatic, crippling terror, but a persistent awareness that the carefully constructed order of his life, and indeed of the city itself, could shatter at any moment. He'd seen small fires flicker and die in the boiler room, quickly quelled by the diligent stokers. He'd heard whispers of sickness in the poorer quarters, of fevers that swept through families like wildfire. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that the very mechanisms that sustained the city, its plumbing, its markets, its crowded thoroughfares, were also its most vulnerable points. The bathhouse, in particular, was a paradox. It was a place of healing and rejuvenation, of social gathering and personal hygiene. Yet, it was also a crucible. The shared water, the proximity of so many bodies, the very steam that made it so inviting, could just as easily become vectors for disease. Thomas often found himself scrutinizing the patrons, not with the usual detached observation of his work, but with a growing sense of unease. He'd see a man enter, his cough a little too persistent, his skin bearing a pallor that spoke of more than just exhaustion. He'd notice a flush on a cheek that seemed too high, too feverish. These were often dismissed, fleeting thoughts that were quickly buried beneath the sheer volume of his daily tasks. But the seeds of apprehension had been sown, and they were beginning to sprout. Then, one sweltering afternoon, the city's fragile equilibrium was violently disrupted. It began subtly, a few patrons complaining of nausea and a sudden debilitating weakness. The attendants initially attributed it to the oppressive heat, the usual summer ailments that plagued the poorer districts. But the complaints grew, spreading like a contagion itself. A distinguished alderman, known for his robust health and booming laughter, was carried out. his face ashen, his breath shallow. The whispers started in hushed tones, then grew into fearful murmurs. A sickness, they said. It's the baths. It's the water. Thomas's own apprehension, once a quiet companion, now began to manifest as a cold, gnawing dread in his stomach. He saw it in the eyes of his colleagues, the same fear reflected back at him. The usual camaraderie was replaced by a tense, watchful silence. Patrons, once eager for the communal warmth, now eyed each other with suspicion, their faces etched with a new, profound anxiety. The laughter that usually echoed through the halls was silenced, replaced by the hacking coughs and labored breaths of the afflicted. By evening, the situation had escalated beyond mere rumor. The sickness, whatever it was spreading with terrifying speed. The bathhouse, once a symbol of civic pride and communal well being, had become a focal point of contagion. A frantic energy permeated the air, a desperate attempt to maintain order in the face of encroaching chaos. Servants scurried, their movements jerky and panicked, trying to tend to the growing number of ill patrons. The stench of sickness, a cloying metallic odor, began to mingle with the familiar smells of soap and steam. And then the city guard arrived. Their heavy boots echoed on the stone floors, their armor glinting ominously in the dim light. They moved with a grim efficiency, their faces impassive, their purpose clear. Barriers were erected at the entrances, sealing off the bathhouse from the outside world. The pronouncement was stark and unequivocal: quarantine, no one in, no one out. The city, desperate to contain the outbreak, had locked its doors on them. Thomas found himself trapped, not just within the physical confines of the bathhouse, but within a suffocating web of fear and uncertainty. He looked around at his colleagues, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes wide with a dawning horror. They were isolated, confined with the sick, the dying, and the lingering, dreadful possibility of becoming one of them. The steam, once a comforting embrace, now seemed to carry the very essence of the disease, swirling around them, an invisible enemy. The water, their livelihood, now felt like a tainted elixir. He remembered the baker's simple loaf of bread, the scholar's thoughtful comment, the merchant's unexpected coin, small acts of kindness that had once felt like lifelines. Now, they seemed like memories from a distant, impossible past. The carefully nurtured embers of hope were being rapidly extinguished by the icy blast of this unforeseen catastrophe. The bathhouse, their sanctuary, had become their prison, and the very air they breathed was thick with the specter of death. The low-level dread he had always carried had finally, irrevocably manifested, transforming his world into a nightmare of confinement and contagion. The routine, the familiar rhythm of his days had been shattered, replaced by the terrifyingly unknown. He was no longer just an attendant. He was an inmate, a potential victim, trapped in the belly of a beast that threatened to consume them all. The distant calls of the city outside, the faint sounds of life carrying on, were a cruel mockery, a reminder of the world that had so abruptly slammed its doors shut. The steam, the symbol of their work, now seemed to condense into a thick, suffocating shroud, a chilling testament to their isolation. The water, that ever-present element, now felt like a dark, sentient entity, silently complicit in their doom. The silence that descended after the guards secured the entrances was more unnerving than any noise. It was a heavy, pregnant silence, broken only by the rasping breaths of the afflicted and the stifled sobs of those who understood the gravity of their situation. Thomas stood by one of the grand tiled columns, his hands gripping its cool surface as if for support. Around him, the other attendants moved with a disoriented kind of urgency, unsure of what to do next. Some were already tending to the sick, their faces set in grim determination, while others huddled together, their eyes wide with a fear that was rapidly morphing into a quiet despair. The patrons, those who were still lucid, were a tableau of suffering. Some lay prostrate on the benches, their bodies racked with fever, while others sat bolt upright, gasping for air, their eyes darting around with a primal terror. The carefully maintained order of the bathhouse had dissolved, replaced by the raw, unvarnished reality of a plague. Thomas found himself observing the scene with a detached horror, a strangely familiar sensation. It was akin to watching a storm gather, the unsettling calm before the inevitable fury. He saw Master Gideon, the baker, being helped by his wife, his usually ruddy complexion now a sickly gray. His breath came in short, shallow bursts, and a sheen of sweat coated his forehead despite the coolness of the stone. Thomas remembered the warmth of the bread, the simple kindness of the gesture, and a wave of profound sadness washed over him. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. He saw the washerwoman, her stoic resilience tested as she tried to comfort a weeping child whose mother had succumbed to the sickness hours earlier. Her rough hands, usually so adept at wringing out damp linen, now gently stroked the child's feverish brow, a silent testament to a shared humanity that transcended the circumstances. Thomas's fingers instinctively traced the outline of the smooth stone she had given him, a talisman against the encroaching darkness. The scholar, too, was there, not poring over his books, but huddled in a corner, his face etched with a grim understanding of the fragility of life. He looked utterly out of place, his intellectual pursuits offering no shield against the brutal simplicity of disease. Thomas caught his eye once, and the scholar offered a faint, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture that spoke volumes about their shared predicament. The sheer scale of the suffering was overwhelming. The air grew heavy with the metallic tang of illness, a smell that clung to the back of the throat and prickled the eyes. The steam, once a gentle caress, now seemed to condense into a visible miasma, swirling with the whispers of despair. The attendants, caught between their duty and their own gnawing fear, worked tirelessly, fetching water, trying to soothe the agitated, and moving the deceased to a makeshift mortuary in one of the less used chambers. Each body they carried was a stark reminder of their own vulnerability, a chilling premonition of what awaited them. Thomas, despite the growing weakness in his own limbs and the dryness in his throat, found a strange sort of purpose in the chaos. His ingrained habits of meticulousness, honed by years of scrubbing and polishing, now found a new application. He moved through the halls, his movements economical and sure, a stark contrast to the panicked flitting of some of his colleagues. He ensured that water pitchers were kept full, that the few remaining clean towels were distributed, that the floors were kept as clear as possible, even as the tide of sickness rose. He avoided direct contact where possible, his mind a whirl of fear and a desperate instinct for self preservation. Yet, he couldn't entirely compartmentalize his emotions. The sight of a patron, a man who had only yesterday been boasting of his wealth and influence, now reduced to a shivering wreck, was a leveling force, a stark reminder of the great equalizer that was disease. Days bled into nights, marked not by the rising and setting of the sun, but by the ebb and flow of suffering. The initial panic had subsided, replaced by a grim resignation. The guards remained at their posts, their stern faces a constant reminder of their isolation. Food supplies, initially plentiful, began to dwindle. The water, the very source of their predicament, became a precious commodity, carefully rationed. Thomas, along with the few other attendants who remained relatively unaffected, found themselves performing a role of care and survival. They were the living tending to the dying, their own health a question mark hanging over every interaction. He found himself reflecting on the small moments of kindness that had punctuated his life before this nightmare. The baker's bread, the washerwoman's stone, the scholar's observation, they felt like treasures from another existence. He wondered if such acts of grace would ever be possible again, or if this enforced proximity to death had irrevocably altered their capacity for empathy. The steam continued to rise, blurring the edges of reality, making the suffering all the more surreal. The bathhouse, once a vibrant hub of activity, had become a hushed, haunted place, its grandeur overshadowed by the pervasive presence of death. And Thomas, trapped within its walls, could only watch as the unseen enemy claimed its toll, his own fate a terrifyingly open question. He was no longer a mere observer of the city's fragile ecosystem. He was a specimen within its most dangerous experiment, a living testament to how quickly the mundane could devolve into the catastrophic, how swiftly the bubbles of perceived security could burst, leaving only the chilling, unadulterated reality of despair. The hope that had flickered so brightly just days before, fueled by small kindnesses and nascent dreams, was now a fragile, sputtering flame, threatened by the overwhelming darkness of their confined reality. The days had bled into a viscous, suffocating haze within the bathhouse. Weeks had stretched into an eternity, each one a fresh torment in the belly of the city's most notorious crucible. The stench of sickness, a thick, metallic miasma, had long since overpowered the familiar sense of lie and steam. For Thomas, the once soothing warmth of the water had become a chilling mockery, a constant reminder of the invisible enemy that had turned this sanctuary into a tomb. He moved through the shadowed halls, a wraith among the living and the dying, his senses dulled by the perpetual presence of despair. The rhythmic coughs, the gasping breaths, the low moans of the afflicted, these were the new hymns of his existence, a symphony of suffering that played on an endless loop. His hands, once calloused from scrubbing tiles and wringing towels, now trembled with a weariness that went bone deep. Sleep offered little respite, haunted as it was by the gaunt faces of those he'd seen succumb, their eyes wide with a terror that no amount of steam could wash away. The simple acts of kindness he'd once cherished, the baker's bread, the washerwoman's smooth stone, the scholar's quiet nod, felt like relics from a forgotten age, precious artifacts of a life that no longer existed. He had become a creature of habit, his movements dictated by the grim necessities of survival, fetching water, offering a silent presence, and meticulously avoiding any contact that might hasten his own demise. The attendants who remained, those not felled by the sickness, were a collection of hollow eyed ghosts, their camaraderie replaced by a shared, unspoken dread. Each sunrise, or what passed for it within their shuttered world, brought only the grim certainty of more suffering, more loss. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the oppressive silence that had blanketed the city for so long was shattered not by the cries of the sick, but by the authoritative clang of hammers on wood. The city guards, who had become a permanent fixture at the entrances, their stoic faces a constant reminder of their isolation, were now engaged in a different, yet equally ominous task. They were boarding up the grand, ornate entrance to the bathhouse, their movements efficient and final. Rumors, passed in hushed whispers between the few remaining attendants, spoke of a decree from the city council, a harsh judgment delivered upon their contaminated sanctuary. The bathhouse, the very place that had once symbolized cleanliness and communal well being, was now deemed a festering wound, a public health hazard too dangerous to be allowed to operate. The quarantine, so long a suffocating blanket, was finally being lifted, but not in a wave of relief. Instead, it was replaced by the cold, stark finality of closure. For Thomas, this enforced shuddering was a paradox. A part of him, the part that had been consumed by the overwhelming dread and the relentless tide of death, felt a perverse sense of liberation. The weight of responsibility, the constant vigilance, the soul crushing proximity to suffering, all of it was about to be lifted. But another part of him recoiled. This was his life, his livelihood, reduced to a collection of condemned timbers and stained tiles. He had seen the city at its worst, its most vulnerable, its most desperate, and he had survived. Yet, he was now being cast out, his former workplace declared too toxic for even the most hardened of souls. The day the guards finally stepped away from their post, leaving the boarded up entrance to its silent vigil, felt strangely anticlimactic. The air outside, though still carrying the lingering scent of the city's general grime, tasted impossibly fresh, impossibly clean, after weeks of breathing in the stagnant, disease-ridden atmosphere of the bathhouse. Thomas stood on the cobblestone street, the sparse sunlight a blinding assault on his eyes. He clutched a small worn pouch containing his meager savings, the sum total of his work before the quarantine, carefully saved from the tips and small allowances he'd received. It was a pathetic amount, barely enough to sustain him for more than a few weeks, but it was his. It was the sum of his prior existence, a tangible link to the world he had once known. He took a deep, shuddering breath, filling his lungs with the relatively untainted air, and turned his back on the imposing, silent edifice of the bathhouse. He didn't look back. The stench of damp stone, of sickness, of desperation, was seared into his memory, a scent that would likely cling to him, however much he scrubbed. He walked away, his steps tentative at first, then gaining a hesitant momentum. The city, still reeling from the outbreak, was a muted, sore, anxious place. The usual bustling crowds were thinner, their movements cautious, their faces etched with a lingering fear. Yet, there was also a sense of tentative stirring, of life stubbornly refusing to be extinguished. His future was a vast, uncharted territory, a landscape of terrifying uncertainty. He had no job, no immediate prospects, and a mind still shadowed by the horrors he had witnessed. The scars, both visible and invisible, were deep. He knew that the memory of the bathhouse, of the suffering, of the pervasive sense of doom would likely never truly leave him. It would be a constant companion, a whisper in the back of his mind, a shadow that flickered at the edge of his vision. But as he walked, the oppressive weight that had settled upon him, the suffocating blanket of confinement, began to lift, replaced by something far more fragile, yet undeniably potent, a sense of possibility. It was a fragile hope, easily crushed, but it was there, a tiny flickering ember in the ashes of his recent past. He was free in a way he hadn't understood the meaning of before. Free from the steam, free from the shared water, free from the constant gnawing fear of contagion. The city was damaged, its inhabitants wounded, but it was alive, and for now, so was he. The lingering question was, what kind of life would he now build from the ruins?